This video is about the one last thing in your IT system that needs to be moved to the cloud after you've moved your emails, files, phones, security, and device controls into Microsoft 365, which I've talked about in other videos, and after you've moved your business apps around sales, finance, and operations to third-party cloud subscriptions or a Microsoft Azure virtual network, which I've also talked about in another video. The last thing that needs to be moved to the cloud are your end user computers. So I'm talking about a vision of having your entire IT infrastructure, from the backend IT systems to the end user's computers, and in many cases, especially post-pandemic, the company's office space itself being 100% virtual. There's no server computers, physical or virtual, on-premise or in the cloud, and there's no physical end-user computers. You would issue employees virtual desktop computers that they access from other company-owned thin client computers, or repurpose traditional desktop computers that you gave new life to as dummy thin client terminals, or from employee-owned personal devices, which can be whatever operating system the employee prefers. Windows OS, Mac OS, Android, iOS, Linux. And by issuing employees virtual Windows desktop computers, your company no longer has to pay for, maintain, and refresh a company computer inventory. And you'll only pay for the exact amount of compute and disk storage you need for your virtual desktops in Microsoft Azure month to month for your users. If somebody leaves the company, you disable their Azure Active Directory account and their virtual computer disappears, along with the cost of that virtual computer and the subscription cost of their Microsoft 365 cloud services. If you add more employees to your company, they instantly get a fresh new virtual desktop computer in minutes, as opposed to ordering a physical computer, waiting for it to arrive, having IT configure it, then having IT set up the user with it, and then eventually having to pay to replace that computer with a new computer in a 3 to 5 year refresh cycle project. And supporting users on a virtual desktop computer is 60% less expensive than supporting them on a physical desktop computer. At Cerulean, that's exactly the cost difference, 60% less between what we used to charge for traditional managed services for a physical desktop computer on a physical computer system versus a virtual computer system with virtual desktop computers. Virtual computers have less issues, take less IT people to support, and are quicker to provision and deprovision as people come and go in the company. And there's no company capital or having the company tied up in lease agreements in unused company computers that are rotting away in a server room somewhere. And you'll have far better security controls and far more overall control over your data and company apps by using virtual computers you host in your Microsoft Azure virtual network than you do with physical computers spread around at company offices, at home offices around the United States and other parts of the world. And this is all possible because your Microsoft 365 subscription comes with a license of Windows Virtual Desktop. And that's what this video is all about. The practical, real-world, street-smart guide to integrating Windows Virtual Desktop into your company and modernizing your company by moving all or parts of your company to virtual desktops hosted in Microsoft Azure. I'm going to demo how a professionally designed Windows Virtual Desktop system looks like to your end users, and I'm going to demo how the backend in Microsoft Azure looks like to you IT pros out there, and what IT admins need to consider and watch out for when planning a Windows Virtual Desktop project. After watching this video, you'll have seen Windows Virtual Desktop with your own eyes in action, configured for both basic and advanced real-world user scenarios we've implemented at actual clients. So for example, using Windows Virtual Desktop with Microsoft Teams and audio video conferencing in the Microsoft Teams phone system, again, through Windows Virtual Desktop, using thin clients. Another interesting scenario that I'll show you are virtual desktops that require high-end graphics, a GPU processor for 3D rendering in AutoCAD. I'm going to show you what a completely unlocked and open Windows Virtual Desktop can do right out of the box. And I'm also going to show you what a completely locked down and secured Windows Virtual Desktop looks like. I'm also going to show you how you can use Windows Virtual Desktop technology to give people a more limited virtual app window instead of a full desktop window. And I'm going to show you that using Quickbooks. I'm going to show you demos of new HP thin client desktop and laptop devices running Windows 10 Enterprise IoT, and why Windows 10 Enterprise IoT gives us security and flexibility we didn't have with other thin client operating systems. And for you Samsung Galaxy phone users out there, which is what I use, I'm going to show you something really cool. I'm going to show you Samsung DeX, which provides you with a virtual Android OS desktop that you can work with running inside your phone on a full-size monitor, keyboard, and mouse, and how combining that Samsung DeX technology with Windows Virtual Desktop technology creates this really cool scenario where we can run a really powerful Windows OS desktop right from your phone and potentially move to a single device. I ran on Samsung DeX in this way using Windows Virtual Desktop for 2 weeks, and it was awesome. I just had one device, just my phone, everywhere. I was taking it everywhere. And I was still using Teams. I was still using the Teams audio video conferencing in the phone system. It was really cool. The only thing I was missing was a second monitor, which I'm sure down the road is going to be coming. But it's a very cool demo, and hopefully you can move to a single device one day. And to help you better plan out your Windows Virtual Desktop system, I'm going to take you through the professional planning of a Microsoft Virtual Desktop solution. We use our Virtual Desktop Transformer method we've developed at Xerillion, but you can use the ideas from it to plan out your own Windows Virtual Desktop system, or at least get familiar enough with what's possible with Windows Virtual Desktop to have a smart, productive conversation with your Microsoft Cloud partner. And I'm going to take you through actual Azure subscription costs of some real-world scenarios similar to what we implemented at clients, so you can get an idea of what the costs are like. I'm going to show you the things we think through to make the monthly Azure subscription as cost-efficient as possible while still performing well for your users. So what you're going to get out of watching this video is that you'll have a highly informed level of understanding about Windows Virtual Desktop, so you can have a smart and productive conversation with your Microsoft Cloud partner. And it doesn't have to be Xerillion, but you'll need to find a Microsoft Cloud partner, assuming you haven't done several Windows Virtual Desktop projects in the past 12 months yourself. And you'll need to be confident that you can price out the monthly Azure subscription costs, because even though you're licensed for Windows Virtual Desktop technology through your Microsoft 365 subscription, you'll still need to pay for whatever compute and data storage you use to run the virtual desktops in Microsoft Azure. And if you screw up the Azure cost estimate, you could have a large, unexpected runaway Azure bill that'll hurt your career at your next performance review. Or if you underestimate the system, your users won't be happy with the performance. Or if you overestimate the cost of your Azure system, your project won't get approved, and you'll never get the authorization to do the project and modernize your company's IT, as well as modernize your own IT skills as an IT pro. This video is lengthy, and I've packed in a lot here. This is not a 10 to 20 minute YouTube video on losing weight or making passive income. This is real, serious IT work. So I recommend watching what you have time for now, saving this video to your watch later list, and come back to it as you have time so you can get through it all, and then watching it a total of 2 or 3 times, taking notes. I'm absolutely serious, so that you can fully absorb the concepts. I also have this video set up with chapter segments that you can hover over with your mouse if you want to skip to different segments, but I don't recommend it. I'd watch it in order. And again, I put a lot of thought into this video, taking you through everything. I would watch it in order. And again, you'll likely need to watch it 2 or 3 times and taking notes as you go. And if you have any questions or thoughts, post it in the comments so others can see it, because they probably have similar questions. And we're not a huge channel, so I'll be able to come back every few days, look at the questions, and answer it as best I can. So we've got a lot to cover. Let's first discuss why we even consider migrating to Windows Virtual Desktop in the first place. So why would you even want a Windows Virtual Desktop system in the first place? Well, first of all, it's less stressful IT work. Computer hardware brings headaches. The less computer hardware you have to deal with, the smoother and more secure the company becomes, and the better overall quality of life becomes for the IT pros supporting the system. And if the IT pros are having less headaches, that means the users are having less problems, which means the company is performing better overall. Number two, it's far more secure. When you have your email, chat messages, and files in Microsoft 365, access to those cloud services is protected with multi-factor authentication and conditional access rules in Azure Active Directory. And that's a great step forward in IT security. But even better would be if we had controlled access to those cloud services through company virtual desktop computers that we have full control over, as opposed to access by any device anywhere in the world, which is how most companies have their IT security set up today. We're talking about Windows Server NT4 security technology disguised with Windows Server 2016. Number three, reduce IT capital and operating expense. So if you move to Windows virtual desktops, you'll no longer have end user computer refresh cycles. Big capital intensive projects in IT will be a thing of the past. And depending on what you spend for internal and or external IT support, that support expense should be 60% less, and very likely will pay for the monthly cost of hosting your virtual desktops in Azure. So by being 100% in the Microsoft cloud, from your backend IT services to your end user computers, you got rid of 90% of your IT capital expense. And by doing that, your IT support monthly operating expense and complexity went down more than paying the monthly Azure cost of hosting your virtual desktops in Azure. Or in other words, the conversion from paying for your physical desktop computers as a capital expense and moving them to virtual computers as an operating expense will be more than offset by the reduction in your IT support operating expense. Or in even more simpler classic terms, this project will pay for itself. Number four, far more scalable and flexible. Windows Virtual Desktop easily scales with your company. If you add 10 people over 3 months, you'd incrementally increase your monthly Azure spending. If you scale down 10 people in 6 months, you'd incrementally decrease your Azure spending. And issuing virtual computers is fast, much faster than issuing physical computers. Number five, it's far more interesting and modern IT work. For the IT managers that see the writing on the wall when it comes to their careers supporting legacy IT systems, we need less and less of those types of legacy IT pros, and we need far more Microsoft Cloud engineers with the training and experience to implement and manage these systems. So for IT managers with legacy IT skills out there, it's only a threat if you bury your head in the sand. And for CFOs and CEOs that have IT managers that report to them, you'll have much better luck retaining high quality IT people that you like if you have a modern IT environment where those IT people see a real future for them to grow their careers, ideally with your company. Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty of the Windows Virtual Desktop technology, I want to take a moment to connect the dots for those IT managers like myself who've spent a lot of time with Windows Server Remote Desktop Services, which is just the rebranded version of the product that we called Microsoft Terminal Server for those that go way back. So here's a good example of what we used to do when we build out a legacy Windows Server Remote Desktop Services system, either on-premise or in an Azure virtual network. So we'd have a couple domain controllers set up. We would have an RDS, Remote Desktop Services, licensing service running. We would have a connection broker service, an RDS gateway service, of course, a Windows Server session host server, and then a file server. Sometimes these things were on their own virtual machine. Sometimes we could put them on the same virtual machine. If the system was on-premise, then of course we would have physical hardware and a server rack. And then we would have a firewall with a VPN for remote access into this system, secure remote access, and also to do content filtering to protect the stability of those session host desktops. And then we would have a backup and disaster recovery system. So in the event of a fire, flood, pandemic, whatever, where this office is not available or these servers are not available, then we'd be replicating virtual copies of these servers out to another data center somewhere so that if something happened to them, we could spin them up. And then we had software to deal with. We had software licenses. We had Windows Server and Windows Server Client Access licenses. We'd have remote desktop client access licenses, and those were not cheap. With an on-premise system, we had hardware. And then in order to make it robust, we would actually have to set up redundant host servers. And again, have a backup and disaster recovery system. We would have reoccurring costs. So even though there was one big capital expense, or maybe the client, they would lease the equipment, but more often not, they would just make one big payment to get the whole thing done. But it still was a reoccurring cost. It just happened every 5 years as opposed to being monthly. But they had a backup and disaster recovery system. They had a 5-year system refresh cycle, and they had professional support. They had monthly costs to maintain this system, and it's a fairly complex system. So they had professional support. That could be internal IT support salaries or third-party managed service provider fees. And it was cost efficient, and there was security vulnerabilities. For an on-premise system, we would purchase for peak demand and storage during the 5-year life cycle, which meant we'd buy way more processing power, way more memory, way more disk storage, way faster disk storage than we needed, and tons of redundancy on that disk storage. And it was very inefficient. We had high internal or external IT support costs. There was no uptime SLA because we hosted it ourselves on premise. We could get some kind of SLA if we put that as a virtual machine in Microsoft Azure with premium SSD drives, which is something I'll talk about later in this video. But overall, for that system, there is no uptime SLA. And it's weak security and redundancy, and it's high complexity. And then the beauty of this is when we move this to Windows Virtual Desktop Services, we get rid of a lot of virtual machines. We get rid of the domain controllers. We get rid of the RDS licensing service, the connection broker service, the RDS gateway, the file server. We get rid of any physical servers on site. We get rid of the firewall and the VPN. We get rid of the backup and disaster recovery system. The only virtual machine that we have to manage is the Windows 10 multi-user session host. And I'm going to talk quite a bit about that. And I'm going to talk about what happens to all of these former virtual machines. These are going to become cloud services, and I'll get to that in just a moment. But our software licensing becomes very simple. With our Microsoft 365 subscription, we get the Windows Virtual Desktop technology. So we no longer have to maintain Windows Server licenses or CALs or upgrade them. We don't have to deal with remote desktop CALs. We don't deal with any hardware. We don't have to worry about redundant host servers, backup and disaster recovery systems. Backup and disaster recovery system recurring cost goes away. The 5-year system refresh cycle. We're never going to have a refresh project ever again. And the professional support costs, the internal IT salaries or the managed provider service fees are 60% lower, or at least they should be when you're looking at these systems and getting quotes from different providers. 60% lower support costs to maintain this system because it's less complicated, more simplified. And the Azure subscription, because I know what some people think, we're like, well, if I'm moving my virtual desktops from physical computers that I used to purchase, and they're on 3-year computer refresh cycles, if I take that, now I have, instead of a cost that's every 3 years, I have a monthly cost of Microsoft Azure. Well, I don't want that. Now, all I've done is switch from a cost that I have 1/3 of my computers every year. Now I have to pay for these computers on a monthly basis. No, because this is a less complex system. It doesn't take as many IT people to support. It takes a cloud IT pro, but not as many IT people to support. That reduction in monthly cost for the support is more than going to offset the cost to host these virtual desktops in Azure. And this is a much more stable, more secure system overall. And then cost efficiencies go away. We no longer have to purchase, like we do an on-premise system, for peak demand during a 5-year guess at what we're actually going to need. We're only going to purchase for what we need right now for the company. And we don't have the high internal or external IT support cost. We get an uptime SLA from Microsoft. And I'm going to be talking about that as well, how we get that constructed with cloud services. And we have very strong security and redundancy built into the system, and it's much more simplified. And that simplification now is morphed into this. Our 2 domain controllers now are morphed into a cloud service called Microsoft Azure Active Directory Domain Services. And when we move to Microsoft Azure Active Directory Domain Services, we are still working with our traditional domain admin tools, but we don't manage, maintain, or update any virtual machines. And the service has a 99.9% uptime SLA for Microsoft. Our file server is now moved to a cloud service, Microsoft's File Server as a Service cloud service called Azure file shares. And the beauty about this is we only have to purchase the amount of storage that we need right now, and it'll just grow with us. We can still map drives and do all that stuff we're used to doing with a traditional file server, but we also get a soft delete capability, which is if somebody goes into one of our file shares that we create here in Azure file shares and they intentionally or accidentally delete a file, we get a soft delete mechanism which retains that file for a period of, we can set it for 7 days. And even an administrator can't go in to a soft deleted file and delete that file. So if somebody accidentally or intentionally blows away a file or folder, we can go in before we even have to deal with going to Azure Backup and getting those backups. We can go into our soft delete recovery folder and grab that file and bring it back, which is something we don't have on traditional file servers. And then our remote desktop services, broker service, gateway service, and license service, those are all just part of the Windows Virtual Desktop services. It takes care of all of those. We don't have to manage any of that anymore. Plus, we get a load balancer service and FSLogix, which holds user profiles and allows us to mount user profiles that are stored in Azure file shares as virtual hard drives, which we can mount to the session host. And I'm going to be talking about that in quite a bit of detail later on in this video. So further simplifying things, we don't need a firewall, either on-premise or if we're building this in an Azure virtual network, we don't need a virtual firewall. We don't need a VPN layer. We just need the Windows Virtual Desktop client, because the Windows Virtual Desktop service back at Azure, it's going to listen for a connection request, and then it's going to make an outbound connection back to your Windows Virtual Desktop client app that the user used to initiate the request. So you don't have to have this separate firewall layer, physical or virtual, to mess around with, and a layer of VPNs to configure and deal with, and your users have to struggle with to access your virtual desktops. And then the backup and disaster recovery system you'd use for an on-premise system, that's replaced with a cloud service called Azure Backup and another one called Azure Site Recovery. And again, these don't have any servers to manage or maintain. These are just cloud services that we configure, monitor, and manage. Azure Backup gives us that classic ability to go back in time to recover files, folders, or virtual machines from days ago, weeks ago, months ago, years ago, and still be in compliance with our retention policies. And Azure Site Recovery gives us the ability to have a replicated copy of our Azure virtual network and virtual machines in a second data center at least 500 miles away from where our primary data center is at, in the case that the data center where our production virtual network is gets hit by a meteor or a nuclear bomb. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later in the video. And then the Windows Server Remote Desktop Session Host on our legacy system is now replaced with a Windows 10 Enterprise Multi-User Session Host. And this is where the money is really spent. 80% of the money of our Windows Virtual Desktop system is spent right here. And we're going to be talking about that in quite a bit of detail later in the video. But it is an operating system that is only available to us in Microsoft Azure, and we are licensed for that operating system through our Microsoft 365 subscription. So this legacy Windows Server Remote Desktop system now becomes this. These are all cloud services. There's no virtual machines. The domain controller is a cloud service. The file server is a cloud service. The Windows Virtual Desktop service is a cloud service. The backup and disaster recovery system is a cloud service. The only virtual machine that we need to build, maintain, and manage is our Windows 10 Enterprise Multi-User Session Host. And we're going to be discussing how to size that out and protect it in a lot more detail. So let's go back and look at that legacy Windows Server Remote Desktop Services system. Here's all the stuff that we have to build, service, support, and refresh. And there is no SLA from anyone. And you will have another refresh project in 5 years. To this, the only virtual machine that we have to build, support, and maintain is our Windows 10 Enterprise Multi-User Session Host. Everything else here is a cloud service where we configure it, monitor it, but we don't manage the underlying hardware or software, and we only pay for what we use. And all of this has a 99.9% uptime SLA from Microsoft. And this is all just a much simpler system to maintain and support, which means your IT support costs for this system should be 60% less expensive. And that cost reduction should cover the cost of having your virtual desktops hosted in a Microsoft Azure network versus purchasing for physical desktops and putting them on a 3-year replacement cycle rotation. And the load balancer and FSLogix services that come with the Windows Virtual Desktop service gives us the ability to drive down that monthly Azure cost even further. And I'm going to show you exactly what I mean later on in the video. So in Windows Virtual Desktop System, by utilizing Azure Cloud Services instead of traditional virtual machines, we're able to get rid of a bunch of virtual machines we used to have to set up, monitor, backup, maintain, and refresh. But we're still not done driving down the cost and efficiency of a Windows Virtual Desktop System. We have 3 more areas to plan out when we build out a Windows Virtual Desktop System as part of our Virtual Desktop Transformer process. Session host workday scaling, FSLogix user profile mounting, and drain mode. So the first thing we're going to dive into is session host workday scaling. And this is where we're going to ask a few questions. Now, a great feature of Azure is that I can save money by turning my servers off when I know I don't need them. So that's always one of the first questions we ask customers. I know they're going to tell me there is always 1 or 2 people that are on the system, late nights, evenings, weekends, the CEO, they work 24/7. I get all that, but the reality is, from my own experience, is that those situations are the exception. And if I told you that we can change the system easily anytime to be on or off whenever you want, but that you don't have to pay for your servers when they're not being used, is there a time we could turn the hosts on or off that would meet the needs of your company, but also ensure that you aren't wasting money by paying for compute time when nobody's actually using the system? So most of the time, we hear that 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. weekdays is going to cover the company. And they'll go along with that as long as they feel reassured that if they need to expand the hours or add weekends easily in the future when needed, that they can do that, which again, we can easily do within minutes. But that being said, some companies absolutely need their session hosts up running 24/7. But rather than having one large expensive session host running 24/7 and having that large expensive host running underutilized 2/3 of the time outside of business hours, evenings, weekends, or running multiple smaller session hosts, they're less expensive, but we're running more of them and we're running them 24/7. We could do something called scaling out and scaling in. So to illustrate a scale out, scale in situation a little further, in a scale out scenario, we have 2 session hosts, and then we go to 4 session hosts. We scaled out, or we increased the number of session hosts. In a scale in situation, we went from 4 session hosts and we scaled into 2 session hosts. In a scale up scenario, we went from an F4S, which is a compute instance in Azure that has 4 vCPUs, 8 gigs of memory, 6400 IOPS. We scaled up to an F32S, which has 32 vCPUs, 64 gigs of memory, and 5100 IOPS. When we scaled down, I went from an F32S compute instance down to an F4S compute instance. But for our Windows Virtual Desktop System that we're building out here, we're interested in a scale out and scale in scenario. And it looks a little more like this. In our Windows Virtual Desktop System, we're going to start at 6 a.m. overnight. We're going to be running 1 session host, but at 6 a.m., we're going to scale out to 4 session hosts. And then at 6 p.m., we're going to take our 4 session hosts and we're going to scale in to 1 session host. And so this is the first critical step to not wasting money. We purchase the bulk of the compute power we need for the customer during the business day. And then we buy just a little bit of compute power for anyone that needs to get in after hours. But to make this work smoothly and cost effectively with multiple session hosts, we need a few key technologies that are part of the Windows Virtual Desktop service. And those 3 technologies would be these here: the Azure Load Balancer service, the FSLogix user profile mounting service, and drain mode. And we get all 3 technologies as part of the Windows Virtual Desktop Cloud service. So let's first start with the Azure Load Balancer service. So here we have Mike, and Mike wants to log into his Windows Virtual Desktop, which is up in here. So now the Windows Virtual Desktop gives us this handy Azure Load Balancer service as part of the Windows Virtual Desktop service. And this is something we actually pay extra for if we were building a legacy Windows Server multi-host desktop service. But with Windows Virtual Desktop, it's included, and we don't have to configure anything. The load balancer keeps track of which session hosts are up and available. And as people connect in, the load balancer assigns them to one of the session hosts. And it can do so in a round robin style, or what we call breadth first, which means evenly distributing users as they connect in across the available hosts. Or it can do it in a depth first mode, where it fills up one host at a time as users connect in. And the load balancer service also gives us redundancy in case one of the session hosts has a problem or needs to be worked on. We can actually just shut it down and users will be moved over into the other session hosts. It also gives us the ability to enable drain mode on our session host to scale in our session host after hours and save money while providing users 24/7 access to their virtual desktops. So it used to be with traditional Windows Server Remote Desktop services, we never had a nice way that we felt confident in at Xerillion to shut down session hosts at the end of the business day without interrupting a user's live session. There were theoretical ways to do it, but it was all scripting and PowerShell. And again, we just didn't trust it, so we didn't do it. The host servers were either on or they were off. We either ran them 24/7 or we ran them during business hours and shut them down and turn them on again. In Windows Virtual Desktop, we get drain mode, and it works really, really well. If we have our full set of session hosts running, say, 6 a.m. in the morning to 6 p.m. weekdays, but we want to leave one host running after hours, so the users have a 24/7 availability of their Windows Virtual Desktops, then at, say, 5 p.m. towards the end of the day, we put 3 of our 4 session hosts into drain mode. And once that happens, the host is checked every 15 minutes to see if it has live virtual desktops running. And as users log off or they go inactive, eventually the host won't have any live sessions. And then it will be shut down for the evening until we get to a single host, which we will leave running overnight. So no user's live sessions are going to be abruptly terminated, and the company isn't wasting money purchasing compute in Azure when nobody is using the system. And the Windows Virtual Desktop Load Balancer is keeping track of which host went offline and which host is staying online, so it isn't sending any new connections to the hosts that are offline. It's only sending new connections to the one live host that we kept running after hours. Then at 6 a.m. the next day, we configure Windows Virtual Desktop to scale out again to the full set of hosts for the business day. And then at 5 p.m., the system goes back into drain mode and starts the process all over again. So here we have our Windows Virtual Desktop host pool. There are 4 session hosts running inside the host pool. These are the virtual machines that are really costing us money in the solution. These are the ones we want to be efficient with. So we have the session host pool, and we're running that during the business day. Our business day starts at 6 a.m. We are fully scaled out to all 4 of our session hosts. And what happens is they run all day, and then at 5 p.m., we put them all into drain mode. So each one of these is going to be polling to determine, do I have live users running virtual desktops inside of me? And as users log off the virtual desktops and they sign out of the session host, or they go inactive for, let's say, over an hour, we will have session hosts that will say, well, I just polled and I don't have any live virtual desktops running. I'm going to go ahead and shut myself down because I'm in drain mode right now. So let's say between 5 p.m. and 6 p.m., we're down to 2 session hosts. And then between 6 p.m. and 7 p.m., we're down to 1 session host. And then what we do is we leave that 1 session host running overnight, all the way until we get back to 6 a.m. the next day. And then the process starts all over again. But this drain mode, along with the load balancer, allows us to be very efficient with our use of our virtual machines running the Windows 10 multi-user session host operating system, which again is where the real money is spent inside of a Windows Virtual Desktop solution. So we went over how we scale out and scale in our session hosts so we're not wasting money on paying for compute time in Microsoft Azure that nobody's using after business hours, evenings, weekends, but we still want to make our virtual desktops available to those users 24/7. So we run one session host after hours. And by providing multiple hosts with a load balancer, we also create redundancy in case one of the hosts has problems and we need to work on it during the business day. And we also went over how we can elegantly scale in our session host at the end of a business day without breaking our users' live sessions by enabling drain mode in the Windows Virtual Desktop service. But with multiple session hosts and a load balancer, sending Mike to any one of the session hosts at any time, you might be wondering, what happens to Mike's user profile? So you remember roaming profiles? They're amazing, weren't they? How great was it to log into a computer and wait for your profile to download to your local computer, or to have your profile saved on a network share and work with it over a local network? It was awful. It was a good idea in theory, but I never actually saw it work well. And they were always a complaint item when I was meeting a prospective client for the first time. I remember every time as a field IT consultant in early 2000s that I came across roaming profiles, I always had as part of my proposal to get rid of the roaming profiles and move the profiles back to being local, or move the client to a terminal server if their staff need to be able to roam around. So the good news is that to make a multi-host Windows Virtual Desktop system work, we need a way to give users access to their user profiles from any session host. And for that, thankfully, in 2018, Microsoft bought a company called FSLogix, who solved this problem gracefully. And the license for this technology is included in your Microsoft 365 subscription. Now let's go back to our buddy Mike over here. He's going to connect to his Windows Virtual Desktop in here, and he's going to use the Windows Virtual Desktop Client app. And let's see where FSLogix helps us. So we're going to bring in the FSLogix service over here. And the FSLogix service is going to allow us to attach Mike's user profile as a hard drive to whichever of the session hosts that the Azure Load Balancer assigns Mike's connection to. Now, to make this work, FSLogix needs a shared file folder. And for that, we're going to use Azure Files. We're going to set up a shared folder, just like you're used to, but we don't have any file server virtual machine to deal with. And so we're going to set up a shared folder called User Profiles. And inside of that is where we're going to store the user profiles, which are going to be in a VHD file format. And that's what the FSLogix service is going to access and use to be able to mount these VHD files as profiles for these users on whichever virtual machine session host the load balancer is going to send Mike or any other user to. So Mike initiates a connection to the Windows Virtual Desktop service using the Windows Virtual Desktop Client app, and his request hits the connection broker. And the connection broker goes to the load balancer, and the load balancer assigns Mike to one of the session hosts in the session host pool. Then the FSLogix service goes to the file share where the user profile VHDs are stored and pulls Mike's user profile VHD file. And then the FSLogix service then mounts Mike's user profile as a VHD file on the session host dynamically. And once that VHD file is mounted as a hard drive on that particular session host, only Mike can see his user profile as a mounted drive on that session host, and he doesn't have access to any other users' mounted profiles on the session host, and they don't have access to his. Then when Mike wants to log off, FSLogix moves Mike's profile back to the file share. So in this situation, Mike's profile is mounted quickly as a single file dynamically to any of the session hosts. And unlike the old style roaming profiles we used to deal with, we didn't have to download Mike's profile to work with it, or we didn't have to access it over a network. It stayed mounted directly to the session host for fast, secure access and is returned to the file share when Mike's done with it, all inside the Azure Virtual Network. This is where FSLogix is taking over, and it's going to go get my user profile from Azure Files, and it's going to quickly mount it onto the hard drive on my session host, and then go ahead and all my profile settings are going to be brought dynamically onto that session host. Now, as I log in, you're going to see it's going to there, FSLogix app service. Now, FSLogix is going to Azure Files file share. It's grabbing my user profile as a VHD file, and then it's going to mount it to the session host that the Azure load balancer assigned me to. And then it's going to bring up all of my desktop settings, all my saved preferences and everything like that. And it's going to work the same no matter which session host the load balancer sends me to. Now let's get into some actual demos. And first we're going to start with the Windows Virtual Desktop Client app, which is this icon right here. But I want to connect the dots a little bit to those people who spent many years and are used to the Remote Desktop Services Client, the Remote Desktop app that you're all used to right here. So if I go ahead and bring this up, you're all probably used to this right here. So we go ahead, typically, if we're on site, we would just go ahead and need to put in the remote desktop server name, put in our username, set any settings that we want to set here, and go ahead and save this as an icon, put this on the user's desktop, and they can connect into a virtual desktop. And if it's remote, we're going to have to establish a VPN connection. So we'll have to have a VPN client on the user's laptop. They'll connect into the VPN on the firewall that we're hosting, and then they will be able to connect into this remote desktop client. Now over here we have the Windows Virtual Desktop Client app. And if I click on this, it's a different experience, as you can compare here. Now let me take you through this real quick. Again, here's the old legacy remote desktop server, remote desktop client. Here is the new Windows Virtual Desktop Client. Unfortunately, you can see they have similar names. The old one, the legacy one, says Remote Desktop Connection, and this one just says Remote Desktop. But this is the Windows Virtual Desktop Client app. But here what's pretty cool is you can see right here, these are all the different workspaces that I have set up. And I'm going to be demoing all of these in this video. Here I've got my standard desktops, which I'll be showing you. This is a standard desktop with Windows Virtual Desktop just right out of the gate without doing any changes to it. I want to show you what you get as default and how flexible it is as far as being able to work with your local computer as well. I'm also going to be demoing a highly secured, highly locked down virtual desktop. I'm going to be using the finance workspace here to demo what a virtual app looks like. So let's say there's sometimes that you want to give users a virtual window to an app instead of a full virtual desktop. Well, we can do that with Windows Virtual Desktop technology. And I'm going to be demoing that using Quickbooks. And then I'm going to be demoing a high-end, high GPU, high graphics virtual desktop. And this is the one you would use to do AutoCAD 3D rendering. And I'm going to be showing you a heavy-duty 3D rendering app to really put this thing through the paces. I mean, something that will not even run here on a standard desktop. It won't even run it, but it will run very smoothly over on the engineering desktop. And I'm going to be taking you through each one of these. But what's really neat about this is, unlike this, where I have to go in, I have to configure it, I have to have a VPN, this remote desktop client app, this has a secure connection already. So this is using HTTPS. And also, when I connect into this the first time and I have to put in my Azure Active Directory username and password, if this app and that service hasn't seen my computer before, if it's a new computer on my account, I'm going to be prompted with multi-factor authentication. And then once I have registered this device under my Azure Active Directory account and it's all good, I've passed multi-factor authentication, when I click on it in the future, all of my workspaces that I have access to, which I have subscribed to, are going to automatically pop up. That is so much easier for the user. And you can see right here, these workspaces, all the admin had to do, if they wanted to give a user a standard desktop, they just had to add them, give them permissions to that workspace through the application group, which again, I'm going to walk you through later in this video how that works. But then once they are subscribed to it, they immediately have access to it. Same thing, if you want to give that person access to a highly secured desktop or the finance desktop or the finance remote app or the high-end graphics CPU, which we want to be careful who we give access to that because these are pricey compute instances. All I had to do was give that user permission to it. And when they log into Remote Desktop next time, they're going to see a little message saying it's updating their subscriptions, and immediately they're going to see this new workspace. So this is a lot simpler. I don't have to have a VPN because this right here is already a secured connection. I don't have to manually go in and specify which remote desktop server I'm connected to because the user doesn't have to worry about any of that. The administrator doesn't have to worry about any of that. They can figure all of that with what I'm going to be showing you later in this video. But the user gets this nice interface right here and then get right into their virtual desktops. So we're going to be saying bye-bye to this. It's been with us for decades, but it's time to go. So we're going to go ahead and let that go bye-bye. And we're going to be focusing on the Windows Virtual Desktop Client app because this is the future of virtual desktops. And this is the app you're going to be working with a lot. And this is the app your users are going to enter into securely into your Windows Virtual Desktop system. So now I want to show you what Windows Virtual Desktop will look like if you haven't done any configuration, just the default settings and what it can do right out of the box. So I'm going to go into these standard desktops that I have set up right here. I'm going to go ahead and click on the standard desktop. So I'm in the standard desktop. Now, the first thing I want to show you that I thought was really nice when I got in here the first time is I want to go into Windows File Explorer. And if I go ahead and click on it right here, and I were to click on this PC, you can see right out of the gate, I have redirected drives and folders. And here are all of my local hard drives on my laptop. So I'm using my laptop right now to connect in my Windows Virtual Desktop. Right out of the gate, you can always lock this down if you want. I'm going to show you what a lockdown Windows Virtual Desktop looks like. But I thought, wow, this was really nice. All of these hard drives came right up, didn't have to do any configuration. And now I could move files back and forth between the hard drives if I had a thumb drive that I wanted to stick in there. And this Windows Virtual Desktop wasn't one we were concerned about as far as security issues. We just wanted to give users the ability to be able to move files back and forth between a local laptop or a mobile thin client, or even a desktop computer. They'll be able to do it very simply. And also, here is my OneDrive. So here's my OneDrive, and also these are all cloud files. So they don't come synced right out of the gate. I would have to go ahead and synchronize this or double click on a file, then it'll know to keep that file synced. But the same files that are on my laptop, they're right here on my Windows Virtual Desktop. And I can still go in and set up the synchronization for my channel file folders inside of Microsoft Teams. So here is the marketing files inside of our marketing team channel. And it's the same ones that are inside of Microsoft Teams as well. And then if I were to go into Microsoft Word, here are all of the Word documents that I've been working with recently. And here I am. I'm all synced and connected in. And it keeps that for me. It stays synchronized with what I've been working on multiple different devices. And here's good old Outlook. Here's all my email. Again, that is synchronized. And here is Teams. And I'm going to be demoing Teams further when I show the audio, video conferencing in the Microsoft phone system with Windows Virtual Desktop. And I have some really important points with Microsoft Teams and Windows Virtual Desktop. But your apps are all synchronized. They're all here. And also your printers right here. If I go into settings and I go to printers and scanners, you can see right here, here's my Xerox VersaLink C405. It's not even connected directly to my laptop. It is on my home network here through the network connection. But the Windows Virtual Desktop automatically picked up on all of that. I didn't have to configure any of this stuff. It saw that I was logged in with my Azure Active Directory account, and each one of the apps, it did prompt me, since it's the first time it saw that this device connect in to each one of these cloud services, it did prompt me. So I did have to go through that the first time, but after that was done, I'm all set. So I like the fact that everything came up, my local drives, my local printers, all my app settings, OneDrive is synchronized, Teams files are synchronized. My printer is all set for redirection. I can move files back and forth. If I want that sort of capability, then I can move back and forth between my Windows Virtual Desktop and also my local laptop as well. And it's also worth noting that the audio that comes out of your virtual desktop will play to the local audio on the device you're connecting from. So if I have YouTube open here.
Quality writing makes your schoolwork better.
And there's the audio.
In the process.
And I didn't configure anything. It just started working
Grammarly,
just like
the
that.
digital writing assistant that helps students create effective writing.
But it's important to understand too, you're going to have to configure your compute instance to accommodate for that audio and video if you want users to be able to play that. I would say in most cases, most people don't, because it's going to cost extra to be able to have a smooth audio and video experience if you want to be able to play video through the virtual desktop. But it's something that will work right out of the gate as a default. So just know it's there. And again, when I demo Teams, I'm going to be showing not just the audio that you can do through the conference calling and the phone system, but also using the webcam and your microphone attached to your thin client device, whether that's your laptop, your desktop, or a thin client terminal, to be able to use Microsoft Teams completely inside of a virtual desktop. So now I'm going to go back to the Windows Virtual Desktop client app, and I want to show you what a virtual desktop looks like that is completely locked down. I'm going to go here and I'm going to go ahead and fire up my highly secured desktop. And you can see it's going FSLogix is now actually going to go grab my user profile as a VHD file that it used for the unsecured desktop. And now it's moving it to a different Windows Virtual Desktop host pool with a different set of session hosts. And now it's mounting that to the new session host that is in the secured session host pool. Now I'm inside the highly secured Windows Virtual Desktop. And inside of here, all my settings are there because of FSLogix mounting my profile. Here's my OneDrive. Here's my mapped marketing folder from the Teams files. And it's all there for me. And here's Teams. It's all set. And here's Outlook. Now, the thing that's not here is if I go back into Windows File Explorer and I click on this PC, my local drives to my laptop are not there anymore. I, as the administrator, have locked that down. So the user no longer has access to that. They can't move files back and forth. And if I go to printers, you'll also see that my local printer that is on my laptop also now isn't showing up and hasn't been redirected. So in this setting, the user is prevented from moving files back and forth between the Windows Virtual Desktop client and the hard drives on the local computer that I'm working with, and also not able to print to the local printer. So that could be handy if you want to be able to control printing and movements of data from a home office, from remote offices, where you're working with really highly secured data or highly secured apps. And if you want to take a step further, you can actually prevent the movement of files to third-party websites using Microsoft Intune and mobile app management for Windows Enterprise. If you go from using a Windows 10 Enterprise multi-user session host to a Windows 10 Enterprise personal host. And I've shown that in a previous video where you can block the movement of data off of a device that is controlled with Microsoft Intune. If a user were to take a file and move it onto a Google Drive or a Dropbox account right through a web browser, or even attach it as an email and send it to their personal account. So you can only do that though if you're using Windows 10 Enterprise and setting it to personal mode and not as a Windows 10 Enterprise multi-host. So that's in a situation where you have a very secured, very locked down Windows Virtual Desktop where you have very sensitive data and sensitive apps that the user is working with, and you want to control that data. So now I want to show you what working with Microsoft Teams, the full features of Microsoft Teams, specifically around audio, video, conferencing, and the Microsoft phone system would look like if you're using virtual desktops. So I'm in our standard desktop here, and I'm going to go ahead and bring up Teams. And the first thing I want to say about working with Microsoft Teams in a Windows Virtual Desktop environment is that Teams isn't installed and set up with Microsoft Office. You actually have to install this separately. There is a separate version of Microsoft Teams that is for Windows Virtual Desktop. So I had to go and install that. It's a bit of a process. And then when you get that set up, if you don't care about the Microsoft phone system, if you don't care about audio video conferencing, you plan to just use chat channels and private chats and keep your files up in Microsoft Teams, and that's all you plan to do, you can just stop there. But if you want to be able to use audio video conferencing and you want to be able to use the Microsoft phone system through Windows Virtual Desktop, then you've actually got some more work to do. And again, it's not trivial work. It took some time to get this set up. So you could get through it, but it'd be better if you worked with a partner in this particular piece. But I want to show you what you need to see if it's actually configured correctly. So once you've actually got Microsoft Teams running on Windows Virtual Desktop and it's up and you're logged in and that's all good, you actually need to go into your account, go to About, go to Version, and then you'll see right up here, it says WVD Media Optimized. That means you've configured Microsoft Teams correctly to handle the audio, video, webcam redirection from your local device to the virtual desktop. And once that's set up, and seeing that as a beautiful thing, once that's set up, you can go in here and then you can go down to Settings, and then you can go on to Devices. And now you will see, for example, for my speaker and microphone settings, I use my Jabra 370. That's on my laptop. It's not on a thin client. And so Windows Virtual Desktop now is seeing that through the redirection that was set up. And the same thing with my microphone and the camera now, it's picked up the camera from my laptop. You only get that after you set up the media redirection settings and configured it for Microsoft Teams. So again, it's not a simple thing to do. You're going to be in there working through some stuff to get it done. It's more than I can cover in just a video here. I just want to show you what this looks like, and that the default is not to pick up these settings. And even if you go in and install the version of Windows 10 Enterprise that comes with Office installed, it won't have Teams. You got to go download the version of Teams for Windows Virtual Desktop. And then once that's connected and running, the next thing you got to do is you have to go in and you got to configure the media redirection parts of Microsoft Teams, which also has other pieces of software that you need to install in another configuration. So anyway, the good news is it works, but this is where you will go to be able to see that you actually have it in place. You want to see that WVD Media Optimized. And then you can go in and you see the redirection available for your local webcam, speaker, and microphone. And also it's important to know that you see this right here. It says it was last updated, in this case, October 19th, 2020. If you need to update Microsoft Teams on Windows Virtual Desktop in the future, it is a manual process. It doesn't just automatically update itself. So that's an important thing you got to know as well. Also, to power the full audio video experience of Microsoft Teams, I would give your compute instance twice the power that you normally would when you're setting up your session hosts. And we'll talk about that later on in this video, how you're actually going to configure your session host and power it and what the costs are going to be. But for example, if you're going to base a typical session host outside of having audio video running in your Windows Virtual Desktop on an F4 compute instance, if you're going to be running audio video with Microsoft Teams, I would switch that up to an F8 for the same amount of users. So let's use the Microsoft phone system inside of Windows Virtual Desktop. So I've got my headset on, I've got Teams configured on the virtual desktop, I've got the media redirection configured, and now it just becomes like any other time that I want to make a phone call inside of Microsoft Teams. And again, it's worth noting, not that you have to do this every time, but I go under Devices, and my speaker is set to my Jabra 370 for the speaker and the microphone. And those are not on the thin client. These are actual devices that are running through my laptop. But I go in here, I click on the little phone icon, click dial a number, and boom. That's it. And this is all happening through the virtual desktop. And now it just becomes like using the phone system anywhere else. So I'll go ahead and hang this up. And now let's talk about audio video conferencing inside of Microsoft Teams. So what you've got here is that with Microsoft Teams and Windows Virtual Desktop, we show the most active speaker. That's who's going to display right here. And it kind of stutters a little bit depending on bandwidth and things like that, but it does work. And so what you probably are going to want to do is just do the audio video conferencing or the Microsoft phone system on here. And over time, I'm sure this is going to get better and better, where you can see more people in the video as opposed to the regular Microsoft Teams, where you're going to see a nice grid of a bunch of people inside the Teams meetings. Works really, really nice. But inside of Windows Virtual Desktop, probably at this time, while you can see one person actively in the video, you're probably better just turning that video off and just join the meeting in audio. So also, as you can see behind me here, you lose the cool background. You don't have that anymore. So I'm sure those things will come in time, but right now that's what you got to work with. So it does work. You can put this on Windows Virtual Desktop. My recommendation would be just to stick with the audio and not the video at this time. So now I want to go into our Windows Virtual Desktop Client app, and we went through a standard desktop, we went through a highly secured desktop, and now I want to show you a finance desktop, but I'm not going to show you just another regular Windows Virtual Desktop because we saw that here under the standard desktop. Again, I also showed you another desktop that was in the highly secured desktop. But what if we just want to give users, instead of a full virtual desktop window, we want to just give them a virtual app window. So they're still going to be using their full Windows OS on their laptop or their desktop, but we just want to virtualize a specific app and give them that. And it's more straightforward for the users. It's less expensive to provide virtual apps to users if we don't need to give them a full desktop. And it also allows us to provide apps to desktops remotely over wide area networks or internet connections. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to demo that through Quickbooks. So that's one that often gets brought into a virtual desktop because Quickbooks itself, if you're not using the web version, if you're using the traditional version, it's an example of an important finance app at a company that doesn't run well over an internet connection. But through publishing that app inside of Windows Virtual Desktop as a virtual app or remote app, now we can make this very easy and we can make this available to users all over the place, users who don't need a virtual desktop. So I'm going to go ahead and bring this up. And now what we've got here is, this is the desktop that is on my local computer, Windows OS. Here is my taskbar. And what I just opened up in Quickbooks now, this is actually not running locally on my computer. This is a virtual app or a remote app, but it looks like it's running right here. And so I launched Quickbooks. It prompts me with this. I go ahead and I'm going to open up this sample database here. And now I'm inside of Quickbooks and I could do the stuff you would normally do inside of Quickbooks. And what's interesting too is that right here is my printer. So this is my local printer, my home network right here, the Xerox VersaLink, and it's ready to go. And I can work with this just like I'm working on my computer. And Quickbooks and Outlook look like they're running side by side right on my local computer, except this is a virtual app or remote app using Windows Virtual Desktop technology. And this is Outlook running locally on my computer. This you can publish out to users. It can run great over an internet connection because the only thing that's happening here is you're seeing what's happening on the screen. All the processing, all the data is over back on our Windows Virtual Desktop session host, and it's providing just that app window for us to use. And you can use these with any applications that you want to be able to give users access to, or you might want to lock down a little further or just make it a little easier for users. Maybe you don't necessarily want to go down to thin clients for all of your users, again, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but everybody's already got a laptop or a desktop, but you want to simplify things and provide a traditional Windows app, but do it through the Windows Virtual App technology instead of moving everybody to thin client computers. So now we went through several Windows Virtual Desktop workspaces. We went through the standard desktop to show you everything that the system could do right out of the box, how we had access to our local drives, the local printers, how the audio worked right out of the gate. So you could, if you were playing videos, you could hear that. Went over the highly secure desktop. So if you really want to lock things down, and then showed you how a virtual app or remote app looked like if you just wanted to wrap a Windows app into a virtual window and give that to your users that are running regular Windows OS desktops. Now I want to show you what high-end graphics will look like if you are doing AutoCAD, if you're doing 3D rendering, if you're doing high-end graphics and you want a Windows Virtual Desktop to do that. And I'm going to be demoing that with the engineering desktop that I've got set up here. So let's go ahead and get into that. So here I'm inside the engineering Windows Virtual Desktop, and I'm going to take you through some apps. And this has the high-end graphics hardware inside of it. And so if we want to give somebody access so they could do AutoCAD drawings, if they need to do 3D rendering or heavy graphics work, we would put them inside this Windows Virtual Desktop with the NV series Azure Compute instance. So here I have a viewing of a CAD file. You could go in, scroll out. You could go in, take a measurement, and it works just fine. You could go through your different CAD files and do what you normally do, and it flows very nicely, just like you would on a regular workstation. If you wanted to be able to do 3D renderings, here's another example of it. I go ahead, turn this around, do what I normally need to do. If I need to move this around on the screen, I could do that. If I need to do an explode view of this, I could do that, put it back together. Again, none of this graphics processing is happening locally on the computer. It's all happening back over in the Azure Virtual Network on that Windows Virtual Desktop session host. So you could do this on a thin client. You could do this at your house with a low-end computer. It doesn't even matter. You could even do this from your Samsung Galaxy smartphone through the Dex app, which I'm going to show you a little bit later. Literally bringing up the Windows Virtual Desktop app on your smartphone on a regular display, but with all the graphics power happening back over on that Azure Virtual Network. So this is a very powerful way to work. You can bring your engineering, your heavy-duty engineering desktop computer with you anywhere, because that engineering desktop computer is just a virtual computer, and all the important stuff, the stuff that costs money, is securely back in an Azure Virtual Network. And I'm here on this Windows Virtual Desktop, but this is the third different Windows Virtual Desktop that I have shown you in these demos, but all my settings are still here. I go into Windows File Explorer, there's my OneDrive, there's my map drive to the marketing team's channel files, and I still have access to my local computers. I still have access to my local printer. It's all there. No matter where I go, FSLogix is bringing my profile, my preferences, and my settings to each individual Windows Virtual Desktop session host that I'm working on. So I take that wherever I go. Now let's see what this can do if I want to really take it up to the next level and run a graphics benchmarking app. So I'm going to run this at 1920 by 1080, and let's go ahead and see what this can do. And what I'm looking at here, it's kind of hard to see, I'm sure, but it's running at 117 frames per second, and it's showing that I'm using a Tesla M60 GPU. And so all of this graphics rendering is happening over back in Azure, and I'm just seeing the screen changes. So, and this is the bottom NV series compute instance. So if you want to run something really, really powerful, you could take it up from here and go to the 1 or 2 steps even above this. But this will give you a high-end graphics capability and do it on a virtual desktop basis. So when we're designing out a Windows Virtual Desktop solution, we need to determine if we're going to use your existing company computers or just use them as dummy terminals to connect to the actual Windows virtual desktop, or are we going to buy new thin client devices? Professionally speaking, when we build out a Windows virtual desktop system in Xerillium, it's like we're giving everybody a brand new company computer. So if we're putting this much effort in on the back end of the system, which you're going to see further on in this video, we'll have a better, more stable, more secure experience with the project if we take out all the old computers and replace them with new HP thin client devices that use the Windows 10 Enterprise IoT operating system. Now, HP is our longtime computer device partner, and that certainly is the case when it comes to thin client computers. And I'm going to show you a desktop and laptop thin client option and give you my input on them. But before I get into that, let's talk about the operating system that powers the thin clients, which is Windows 10 Enterprise IoT. Now, Windows 10 Enterprise IoT is meant to run single app appliances like medical devices, ATMs, digital displays, kiosks, and in our case, thin client devices. And it gives us that familiar Windows OS interface that you're comfortable with, so you can easily add USB devices like webcam and speakers, and you can manage and secure it with Azure Active Directory and Microsoft Intune. But it's built and sold as a scaled down version of Windows 10 Enterprise. Windows 10 Enterprise is effectively over $400 if you purchased it separately for a computer, whereas Windows Enterprise IoT is less than $80. And here are the key points. Number one, minimal apps are loaded on Windows 10 Enterprise IoT. So in our case, we'll load up the Windows Virtual Desktop Client app and we'll load up the web browser just for backup access. Windows 10 Enterprise IoT is limited to lower power CPUs. There's only a certain level of CPU that you can run with the IoT Enterprise OS. And then the update channel is 66% slower than Windows 10 Pro. And I'm going to show you another slide in a minute, but it's meant to change at a much slower pace. So you're getting security updates, but you're not getting all these feature enhancements and feature upgrades added to the operating system, which potentially will create problems. So you're going to have a much more stable thin client device. And the Windows 10 Enterprise IoT operating system is built for a 10-year device life cycle versus Windows Pro, which is built for a device with a 3-year life cycle. But Windows 10 Enterprise IoT includes all the Windows 10 Enterprise security features, which I'm also going to talk about in just a minute. And Windows 10 Enterprise is the top, most secure operating system that Microsoft makes. Most of us work with Windows 10 Pro, but Windows 10 Enterprise is what the top version of Windows is. But with Windows 10 Enterprise IoT, we get all the security and stability controls of Windows 10 Enterprise, but we have it scaled down so it's much less expensive, 80% less expensive running as IoT versus the full-blown Enterprise edition of Windows 10. So here's an example of what I'm talking about on the update channel. Now, I got this slide from the Windows Champ channel, which I'll link to in the description here because they deserve credit for this. But here, I thought this was a great slide. This shows the Windows 10 Pro updates. There's been 9 of them. And for Windows 10 Enterprise IoT, or the long-term servicing channel, LTSC, which is what Windows 10 Enterprise IoT runs with, there's only been 3. So you're going to get all the enterprise security and stability features of Windows 10 Enterprise, but you're going to get a much more stable operating system to run your thin clients with. And again, referencing a slide that I got when I watched the video from Windows Champ right here, the Windows 10 Pro versus IoT enterprise device controls. Well, with Windows 10, you don't have app blocker, write filter, assigned access, shell launcher, unbranded screens. And let me take you through how this stuff actually matters. All of this stuff has to do with keeping that thin client device nice, stable, secure. So your users who are depending on going in, turning on that thin client and just connecting into their virtual desktop, the last thing that you want as a company or an IT manager is to be messing around with that with a person that's working remote. You want them to be able to just get to their Windows virtual desktop quickly and easily and have very little to do with that thin client device, but you just want to make sure it's secure and stable. And so the key ones here, this unified write filter, this allows the admin to make changes to the device without the user being able to make changes and without having to put any heavy duty management on the device. For me to make changes to the HP thin client that I was working with, I had to go ahead and make changes to the write filter so I could make changes. but once I turned it back on, the user couldn't make any changes to it. I can turn this on as a kiosk with assigned access. If I really want to minimize what the user can do, I can set up a shell launcher. So the user won't even see the Windows operating system. They're just going to get launched into a very simple panel with a couple of buttons that they can click if they want to click on their virtual desktop, the Windows Virtual Desktop Client app, or you want to give them access to a browser. But you can go ahead and make this very simple with the shell launcher. And then of course, with Microsoft Intune, we can set up mobile device management and group policies, credential guard, device guard, and controlled boot, protect identities, and they keep the device secure and stable. So now I want to show you two different models of the HP desktop thin clients that we use in our projects. So the first thin client that we would use here would be for a general user. That'd be the HP T430 thin client. We can hook up to 2 displays. It has one HDMI port and a display port and a VESA monitor mount like I'm showing right here. So you can just tack it right to the back of that monitor so it keeps things nice and tidy. Then if you set up a wireless keyboard and mouse, then it becomes a really clean setup on your desk. And I'm showing here with a monitor, keyboard, and mouse connected up to this device here. But it is nice that it has built-in Wi-Fi. So if you're not necessarily at a place where you can just hook it real quickly into a wired Ethernet network, no problem. You don't have to go and get a USB Ethernet adapter. You can just start using the thing. $499. Again, the general user thin client up to 2 displays. And then the HP T640 is for our power users. So it has 3 display ports, so we can hook up 3 displays up to it. 8 gigs of memory, 128 gigs of SSD local storage, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, Ethernet, $799. So the T640 and the T430 are the HP thin clients that we use for people that want a desktop thin client for their Windows Virtual Desktop solution. And then there is the HP laptop thin client, or what HP calls the mobile thin client, but it's a mobile thin client that looks like a laptop. And you might be thinking, why would I have a laptop thin client? Well, here's what I would say. It's primarily for simplicity, disaster recovery, and business continuity. And it's a better overall value, which I'm going to show you the numbers in just a second on that. But what I like about the mobile thin client is that we have everything ready to go for $799. And we have the computer, the monitor, the keyboard, the mouse, which is the touchpad here, webcam, and speakers. And this will work great on a desktop at an office. And you could add an external monitor, which will give you 2 displays. And you can add a keyboard and a mouse. It can easily be taken back home or with you on the road. And when you're on the road or the plane, just find a public Wi-Fi connection or tether to your smartphone and you're good to go. If for some reason you can't connect to your virtual desktop, just use the web browser on the device as a backup and go into the Office 365 portal. And it's a really good strategy for business continuity if something happens where your office isn't available, like a fire, flood, pandemic, or natural disaster. And this isn't meant to be a full-on laptop computer. Remember, we're talking about virtual desktops here, and it's running Windows 10 Enterprise IoT, which is limited to lower power processors and is just meant to run single app appliances. And like in the case where we'd be talking about Windows Virtual Desktop Client app, and in our case, we'd just be talking about having this HP mobile thin client running the Windows Virtual Desktop Client app and a web browser. And that's it. So I'm going to show you 2 models here. The first is the HP MT21 mobile thin client, and this is for our general users. So it can power 1 external 2K monitor at 60 Hertz. It has 8 gigs of memory, 128 gigs of SSD storage, built-in Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, Ethernet, video camera, mic, and speakers are already built into the system. It's 3.6 pounds, so it's really light. $799. And I'm just showing it here how this user who might take it to an office or work at a home office, they would potentially put a external display and a wireless keyboard and mouse. But if they need to take it home with them, or they need to take it on the road, or something happens to the office, fire, flood, natural disaster, pandemic, and they just need to take the mobile thin client with them, they can easily do so. And then there's the HP MT45 mobile thin client, and that's for the power user. And I have this mobile thin client myself. So you can power 3 external 2K displays if you have that HP USB-C dock G5 right there. Has 8 gigs of memory, 128 gigs of SSD storage, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, Ethernet, video camera, mic, and speakers built into it, 3.6 pounds, $899. So this is a really, really good value when you're thinking about thin clients, because not only does it have everything we need in one form factor, we can power external displays, and also in a business continuity situation, we can just take the computer easily with us and just continue to work. And our virtual computers over back running in Microsoft Azure. So I just want to compare them side by side again to bring home the point. Right here, we have the HP mobile thin client, and it has everything. It has the display, it has the keyboard, it has the mouse with the touchpad, it has speakers, it has the webcam, everything good to go. And if we want to expand on it further, we just hook up a wireless keyboard and mouse and a monitor, and we've got 2 displays. Where over here, if we get the desktop thin clients, well, I've got to add on the webcam, the display, I've got to add on a keyboard and mouse, I've got to add on speakers. And what this unit, which the street price starts at $543, once I've added on these additional pieces, and I don't go super high end, but I go good enough, now I'm at $729 for this setup. It's not really mobile. You know, could I pack it into a box and take it home? Sure. Would I take it on the road? No. This I can do anything with. And we're talking about a difference here of $70 roughly. So might not work for everybody, but I would highly recommend for your solution, if you can adapt these into your system, I would go with the mobile thin client. So I've shown you the different HP thin client devices that we use with clients. I want to show you something that I see as the future for thin clients and the future for computing, and it's pretty minimalist. And it's the Samsung DeX, which is a virtual Android OS operating system that runs as a separate desktop inside your Samsung Galaxy phone. So I know from doing a poll on YouTube that most of the people watching this, over 50%, have iOS. That's fine. I've had several of them. They're great phones. At one point, I just decided I wanted to do something different. And so for the last 6 years, I've been on Android through a Samsung Galaxy, which I've really enjoyed it a lot. So anyway, I found out one day about Samsung DeX, and I have this set up over at my office. So I have several different setups over at my office, but this one I actually like because it's so minimalist. So I have my phone, my Samsung Galaxy 20 Ultra, and I just plug in a USB-C to HDMI cable to it, and that charges the phone and also brings up this display. So I have a large monitor in front of me and a wireless keyboard and mouse. And then I have this Android OS desktop, and nothing changes on my phone. I still have my phone and it continues to do its phone stuff, but I also have this separate virtual desktop. And on this virtual desktop, I then run the Windows Virtual Desktop Client app, the one I download for Android, and voila, I have my virtual desktop, my full Windows OS desktop. And I'm going to show you what that looks like right now. So now I'm into Samsung DeX. I just went ahead and connected up my phone to my computer. It's just easier to show it here as opposed to having a camera pointed down on my desk, which is a whole setup. Anyway, you're going to see what's going on here. So I have my Android OS desktop, and over here is my phone display. It continues to have the same phone display on it. Nothing's changed here, but there's a separate virtual Android OS desktop running inside of it that now I can work with. So one thing that's really cool is all my apps that I normally work with on my phone and I'm on all the time now are available to me right here on my desktop with a full desktop display. It's the same apps, they're all logged in and all that sort of stuff, but I can just run them right here. And again, I use these apps all the time, so it's really handy to have them here this way. And then what if I want, I can take the Windows Virtual Desktop Client and access it here. And here are my workspaces that I was showing you earlier. I have the standard desktop, I have the highly secure desktop, the Quickbooks virtual app or the finance desktop, and I have the engineering desktop. And I can launch right into them right from the Android OS on my phone. And even if I want the virtual engineering desktop, I can run it right from my phone and have all the power of that GPU. But if I just need to be able to get into that virtual desktop in a pinch at home, I can do that very easily. There's FSLogix kicking in, doing its thing. And now here is my engineering virtual desktop. If I said, oh, you know, I want to go in and I want to look at that 3D rendering real quick, I can go ahead and do that. And I can go ahead and work with it right from my phone using my virtual desktop. And this is something I could never do on my actual phone. And I don't even have to remote into the office. I'm just going securely into the virtual network in Microsoft Azure and then accessing whichever virtual desktop that I have access to through my phone. And all I needed was a monitor, a keyboard, and mouse. And I could see us getting to a point where, especially as soon as this could power 2 monitors, it only powers 1 monitor right now, but where it could power 2 monitors, and you have your virtual desktop up in Microsoft Azure, and then you have whatever appropriate power that you need there. Now you're just down to 1 device, your phone. You're not trying to mix a phone display with a full desktop display. They're completely separate, but your phone knows the difference. But all this data and all the power and all the apps you need are on your virtual desktop back in Microsoft Azure, but you're just using 1 device. And then when I'm done working on my virtual desktop inside of my phone, I just go ahead and disconnect it, and that's it. And my virtual desktop stays here just like I left it. So I go right back into it from where I left off the last time I was in. It's really sweet. So now I want to show you, as the IT admin, what being inside the Microsoft Azure portal looks like. So let's go back to this real quick, which is the Windows Virtual Desktop Client app. And so here we got what I was working with earlier. We got the standard desktops. We got the highly secure desktops, finance, engineering. All right, great. So this is what the user sees when they connect into our virtual desktops. Now, what does that correspond to inside the Microsoft Azure portal? Now, inside the portal, I log in there and I need to go to the Windows Virtual Desktop area. So I click on that, and you can see right here, I've got workspaces, application groups, host pools. These are the 3 big items that we work with when we're building out a Windows Virtual Desktop solution. And I'm going to be going over how we build these out and how each of these things play into each other when we're building out and designing a Windows Virtual Desktop solution. But workspaces are where we logically define our Windows Virtual Desktops. Host pools are how we power them, and application groups are how we publish them and assign users to the virtual desktops of the virtual apps. So if I go in here into workspaces, this is a very high level here. I've got my standard desktops right here, my highly secure desktops, my finance desktop, and I was showing you the Quickbooks virtual app and then the high-end graphics engineering virtual desktop. But I want to show you how these correspond to the Windows Virtual Desktop app. So remember those standard desktops we were looking at earlier. If I click on this, all I've done here is logically define that virtual desktop workspace. It's just a logical definition. The stuff that's really important is going to happen in these host pools and these application groups. But this is where the names are defined. So inside here, this is my standard desktop. If I go down to properties, then you can see there I actually have the friendly name. Okay, so there's standard desktops. This corresponds to that right there. Okay, so this is a workspace. And I have the same thing for the highly secure desktops. So if I go back over there, I go to highly secure desktops, I go to properties, and you kind of see what's going on here. Now, to actually power our workspaces, we have to build out host pools. And again, I'm going to be taking you through how we do that. But you can see, just like I have 4 workspaces, just like I have here in the Windows Virtual Desktop app, I also have 4 host pools defined as well. So right here, I have the host pools set up for our standard desktop, and I have my session host right here. And you can see I have 2 virtual machines inside of this host pool, and these power this workspace, which is my standard desktops. And I have host pools for my highly secured desktops, my finance desktops, and my engineering desktops. And then lastly, to actually publish the virtual desktops and the virtual apps. When I say publish, I'm talking about here, to actually see the virtual desktop and actually see the apps that I want to publish as well. Same thing for here in the finance. I got a finance desktop, but I also have Quickbooks where I can just have a virtual app window instead of a full desktop. I do that through the application groups, and that happens right here. So here's all the different apps and desktops. Here's AutoCAD, here's Quickbooks, Teams, Word. Here is my standard desktop. Here's my highly secured desktop. But that's how these work together. So we're going to be going over how the workspaces, that's the first thing we're going to do when we logically design out our Windows Virtual Desktop for users, for permissions, how we want to power this thing. But it's a logical breakdown for our design. We power them with host pools, and that's where we actually put our virtual machines, our Windows 10 Enterprise multi-user virtual machines. And then we publish the apps and virtual desktops to users users with these application groups. And that's how all these things work together. So at a high level, when you are inside the Azure portal, this is where you're going to be spending your time as an admin when you're building out your Windows Virtual Desktop system. So now if you're still with me watching this video and you're finding it helpful, I'd really appreciate it if you'd click on the thumbs up button, which tells YouTube to put this video in the feed of other people just like you who want to learn more about Windows Virtual Desktop. Now, the idea of moving some or all of your users from physical computers to virtual computers probably sounds really interesting, but you're going to have to make a business case to your boss. So you're going to need to know how much this is going to cost, both from the one-time project and the monthly recurring fees, which will allow your company to make an informed business decision. So at Xerillion, we have all this mapped out as part of our service product called the Virtual Desktop Transformer. We go through our menu of possible configuration line items. We make some professional decisions based on our experiences and expertise, and then plug in quantities to determine the one-time cost and the timeline of the project and the ongoing monthly cost, and then provide that to the client, showing them everything we selected for them, what their network will look like at the end of the project, as well as an easy to read summary page. If the client feels the investment is worth the money and their time, then we'll go back and forth adding and removing line items and quantities until we have a system that fits their needs and their budget. Now, Xerillion isn't necessarily going to be a fit for everyone as their Microsoft Cloud partner. For example, we only work with businesses inside the United States and only with businesses that have between 20 to 500 users. So even if your company doesn't fit in those parameters, my goal here is that I'll show you what the system can look like for you and your company and take you through the planning and pricing process that we use so you can have a smart, informed conversation with whoever you choose as your Microsoft Cloud partner. Now, in the event that you are a business inside the United States with between 20 to 500 users, and you are in the market for a Microsoft Cloud partner, you can check us out on our website at Xerillion.com. And if you're interested to talk further, there's a simple contact form you can fill out if you'd like to schedule a call. You can also call us at 847-995-9800, or email us at support@Xerillion.com. But again, the goal here is that you go from not knowing what you don't know to having a vision and some idea of planning and pricing a Windows Virtual Desktop project. So now when we're planning out a Windows Virtual Desktop solution, these are the 7 things that we need to take into consideration. The first thing we got to do is we more than likely are going to have to update your Microsoft 365 subscription. So when people come to us the first time, typically they have what we used to call Office 365. So they'll either have Office 365 E3 or they'll have Office 365 Business Premium. So now we get clients set up with the Microsoft 365 versions of those products. That is a complete solution. So it'll be Microsoft 365 E3 or it will be Microsoft 365 Business Premium. The best value for your money is definitely Microsoft 365 Business Premium. But we'll go ahead and determine which subscription we need to move you to, because all the Microsoft 365 subscriptions have a license of Windows Virtual Desktop inside them. So that's what we need to get you moved over to. And then we need to design out your Azure Virtual Network. And it's no different than if we were building a physical virtual network for a remote office somewhere. So we happen to be building this up in Microsoft Azure. We're going to build out a virtual network. I'm going to take you through the things we got to do when we build out that system. Then we need to define your Windows Virtual Desktop workspaces, which I was just talking about earlier. This is how we logically break down the groups based on security or based on how much power that we need to give these workspaces. Then we need to define your Windows Virtual Desktop workspaces. So this is how we define at a logical level and design out your Windows Virtual Desktops based on security or how much power they need. Then once we define the Windows Virtual Desktop workspaces, we then power them with the host pools. And this is where we spend the real money. Then from that point, we will determine how intense do you want your security to be? Do you want it to be more open or do you want it to be more locked down? And then also your backup and business continuity intensity. How often do you want to have backups during the day? How many backups do you want to be able to go back in time? Days, weeks, months, years? What retention policies do you have to comply with, if any? Or if you don't have compliance requirements, how long do you want to set those backups so you can go back in time? Most people are used to keeping all data forever, all backups forever, and that's fine, but all that data costs you money. And then also the business continuity intensity. The interesting thing is for most on-premise installations, the idea of business continuity means we're going to have an on-premise backup disaster recovery system. system a device that's taking snapshots and replicating those snapshots up into the cloud. And if our on-premise system is not available because of fire, flood, pandemic, natural disaster, or whatever, then we can go ahead and spin up virtual copies of our servers up in the cloud. Well, with Windows Virtual Desktop, if you have your emails, files, phones, security, and device controls in Microsoft 365, and then you have all of your virtual desktops in Azure, well, your backend disaster recovery and business continuity is included in the system. There's no additional stuff to get for business continuity and disaster recovery if you don't have access to your physical office anymore, because all of your IT would be up in the cloud. But if you really want to take it to another level, and you might have a board of directors, investors, big shot clients that would say, well, that's cool that all your stuff is over in Microsoft Azure and the Microsoft cloud, but what happens if that data center gets hit by a meteor or a nuclear bomb? What do you do? All right, well, look, there's probably some reasonable amount of money we're willing to spend to take care of that and have a good, appropriate response to somebody if they ask that question. And that would be something we would take you through. We will take you through what the pricing is. And if you're building out this Azure virtual network that's hosting your Windows virtual desktops, you've got to understand that you're building out a network. It is at that data center. It is not automatically replicated to another data center the way Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, Teams, things like that are. Those are replicated to different data centers. There's nothing more you have to do. When you build out an Azure virtual network, it's in a primary data center, and you have to thoughtfully put planning in place to make sure that in the event something happens to that data center, how fast do you want to be able to recover in another data center? And again, the default is there is no recovery. And so that's something you got to make sure you're talking to your Microsoft Cloud partner about, because there is some design that goes into it. The good news is it isn't crazy expensive, but there's planning that needs to go in for that. And then lastly, how do you want to connect to these virtual desktops? Do you want to connect in with HP thin client desktops or HP thin client mobile laptops? Do you want to use soft clients, the Windows Virtual Desktop app running on the computers that you already have at your office? You're just repurposing those computers that you already have, giving them a lot more life by just using them as dummy terminals to connect to your virtual desktops. Or my favorite option is bring your own device. True bring your own device, not just bring your own device in terms of I brought my cell phone with me to the company. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the company pays the employee, rents business use of their Windows OS computer, Mac OS, Linux, iOS tablet, Android, whatever device they want to connect in with, that they can install the Windows Virtual Desktop Client app, connect in, and have access to their virtual desktop. So the company would pay them to rent business use of that. The employee gets to use whatever OS they prefer, however they want to connect in, and the company doesn't have a computer inventory to maintain. So it's a pretty sweet place to be if you can get there, where all of your back-end cloud services, emails, files, phones, security, and device controls are in Microsoft 365. All of your desktop computers or virtual desktop computers inside of Microsoft Azure, Windows Virtual Desktop, and your employees are connecting to them with their own devices. And as employees come and go, there's no hardware that you need to manage or maintain. There's no inventory. So now let's go a little bit deeper into the Microsoft 365 subscriptions. When people come to us, they have an Office 365 Business Premium subscription or Microsoft 365 E3. And we need to get that moved to a Microsoft 365 subscription. So that's either going to be Microsoft 365 Business Premium, which is $20 per user per month. It's the overall best value. It's limited to 300 users though. After 300 users, you have to get the Enterprise subscriptions. And I highly recommend the Microsoft 365 E5 security add-on. So it's all the best pieces of the top subscription that Microsoft makes, which is Microsoft 365 E5, which I'll talk about in just a moment down here. But we can add it on to a Microsoft 365 Business Premium subscription. Then there's Microsoft 365 E3. So for companies that have Office 365 E3, or they have over 300 users, then we would put them inside of Microsoft 365 E3, and that's $32 per user per month. And it's important to know you can mix subscriptions. You could mix Microsoft 365 Business Premium with Microsoft 365 E3, but they're two different versions of Office. Then you have two different security settings that you have to manage. And I just wouldn't do it. I would just pick one or the other. So if you have over 300 users, I would just put everybody on Microsoft 365 E3. Because again, we got to get everybody into Microsoft 365 subscriptions, because that gives us the license of Windows Virtual Desktop for each one of those users. And then for companies that want the Microsoft Teams phone system, the dial-in conferencing, and the top security that Microsoft makes, that would be Microsoft 365 E5, which is $57 per user per month. And that's what we use here at Xerillion. So our clients that want to be able to explain to customers, let's say they have big shot customers they're working with, hey, we have the top most secure system that Microsoft makes, they would get Microsoft 365 E5. It has everything. If you can swing it, I would do it. But if it doesn't work for you and you have under 300 users, then get Microsoft 365 Business Premium, and then we add on the Microsoft 365 E5 security. And then if you have front desk workers, workers that are in front of a kiosk, or people that just need to be able to get in and access company IT services through a smartphone or a tablet or a web browser, then just get Microsoft 365 F3. That still has the Windows Virtual Desktop license with it, and it's $10 per user per month. It has much less storage for email and files and things like that, but that's probably just fine. You just want to get them in so they can connect into Outlook, so they can connect in, access Teams, and the nice thing is they still get a license of Windows Virtual Desktop. So once we determine what Microsoft 365 subscription you're going to be using, then we need to figure out how we're going to design out the Azure Virtual Network. And building the Azure Virtual Network to host your Windows Virtual Desktops, it's just like setting up a remote office. You build your physical network, you put in a firewall, you'd put in a switch, you'd set up an IP subnet, things like that. So we have to build that out and design that out. So here's the things we're going to design out for your Azure Virtual Network to host the Windows Virtual Desktops. We need to build out the Azure Virtual Network and the IP subnet. So we'll determine what your IP address is going to be, and we'll go and build that out. We'll determine, do we want to set up a virtual firewall? Our firewall partner is WatchGuard. And what we do is we would set up a WatchGuard virtual firebox on an Azure Virtual Network for content filtering to protect those virtual desktops from malicious websites and things like that. But because Windows Virtual Desktop doesn't require us to have a VPN to connect into it, where we normally would put a virtual firewall in place for, it works differently and it's secure without that. And also for content filtering, we can also use Microsoft Defender Advanced Threat Protection, but it still might make sense. You might still want to have a VPN from your headquarters office to your Azure Virtual Network. You might still want to be able to use a VPN for your users to connect in to their Windows Virtual Desktop. And you still might want to do content filtering that way. And that's totally fine. So we make that determination once we built out that subnet, do we use a virtual firewall? Then we would set up Azure Active Directory domain services. So what we try to do is go with cloud services and have as few virtual machines on the system as possible. So gone are the days where we have to either set up 2 virtual machines as primary and a secondary domain controller on the Azure Virtual Network, or add a 3rd or 4th domain controller in the Azure Virtual Network that are part of your local domain. What we want to do is use Azure Active Directory domain services. So it gives us all those classic domain controller services. We actually use the same traditional domain admin tools, but we don't have any virtual machines to manage. We don't have domain controllers to manage, and we get a 99.9% uptime SLA from Microsoft. So when we're building out a Windows Virtual Desktop solution, one of the things you're going to have is you're going to have Azure Active Directory. And then on that Azure Virtual Network that's hosting your Windows Virtual Desktop, we are going to place domain controllers, but they're going to be Azure Active Directory domain services that are going to be the traditional domain controller services, and that is going to synchronize with Azure Active Directory. But again, now we have less virtual machines to manage. And then for file services, we're going to have a place to be able to host your user profiles. FSLogix is going to need that because it's going to need to go and grab the user profiles as VHD files and mount those onto session hosts. So we need at least set up file share for that. But you might also have a need where you need to set up file shares for other things that you're working on your network. Maybe we're migrating up a Windows application that has a SQL server attached to it and it needs a file share. But we would use Azure Files file shares for that. So Azure Files being Microsoft's file server as a service up in Microsoft Azure. Again, just like Azure Active Directory domain services, with Azure Files, there's no servers to maintain. I just pay for the storage that I'm using. The storage can grow with us as our data grows, and I just pay for what I'm using right now. And it also has a 99.9% uptime SLA, and also has a soft delete feature. So if I have a file share and somebody goes in and accidentally or intentionally deletes some files or folders, well, on a traditional file server, I have to go back to the backups to go get that data restored. With Azure Files, it has a soft delete feature and it'll hold that file for 7 days. And even an administrator, once something goes into soft delete, an administrator cannot go in and delete those files that are in a soft delete status. That is really great protection you get right out of the box with Azure Files. And then we need to determine, do we need to migrate any legacy on-premise Windows servers? So you might have some sort of business application for finance, sales, or operations that is a Windows application that is not web-based, but we need to get that migrated up because your Windows virtual desktop computers need to be able to access that Windows app. So let's get that off the network too and get that moved up into this new Azure virtual network we're building for your virtual desktop computers. Now, once we've got these items in place here in points 1 through 5, now we actually have some virtual machines that we need to get put in place. And that is going to be your Windows virtual desktop session host pools. So for each one of the workspaces that we defined, the Windows virtual desktop workspaces, we need to power it with a Windows virtual desktop host pool. These are the virtual machines that are going to be running the apps, providing the virtual desktops and things like that. So we need to define those, power those. I'm going to be talking about that quite a bit here. And then of course we need Azure Backup, which is Azure's backup service. It doesn't cost anything for the service, you just pay for the backup storage. So on our Azure Virtual Network, we have Azure Files, we have our Windows Virtual Desktop hosts. And so those virtual machines and those files need to be backed up, and we're going to use Azure Backup to do it. And we're going to have Azure Backup store a triplicate, 3 sets of backups on your primary data center, and we're going to configure it so another 3 set of backups is in its peering regional data center that's at least 500 miles away. And that is not a default configuration. That is something that we do. And whoever is your Microsoft Cloud solution provider, they need to make sure that that is set up for you at a minimum. So you have 6 copies of your backups, 3 copies in the data center where your Azure Virtual Network is built, and then 3 copies in a peering data center at least 500 miles away in case something happens to that data center. And then Azure Defender is what we would use to protect those Windows Virtual Desktop session hosts, those virtual machines. So Azure Defender is a security service that uses machine learning threat detection to establish a normal pattern of behavior. And when it starts to see apps or things that are going on with the virtual machines that start to verge from a normal pattern of behavior, we can figure what we want to do. Do we kick out that user? Do we shut down an app? Do we alert administrators? But Azure Defender is a key component of keeping the system stable and secure. Now, before we go any further, I want to make sure we're on the same page as far as Windows Virtual Desktop workspaces, host pools, and application groups, and the differences between them and how they work together. So back when we were in the Azure portal in the Windows Virtual Desktop workspace area, I kind of went over those things. I was trying to show inside the portal what those look like, workspaces versus host pools versus application groups. But the workspace is how we logically break down the different groups based on the sensitivity of the apps and the data, based on how pricey are the Windows virtual desktops we're setting up those users, or we set it up based on security. So it's based on data app sensitivity, based on how locked down do we want to make these virtual desktops, or if we have something as far as high-end graphics or number crunching compute instances that are much more expensive than the traditional desktops. We define that out at the workspace level. And then we power those workspaces with host pools. These are the actual virtual machines that are providing the virtual desktops, and in some cases, the virtual apps. And these are going to be running Windows 10 Enterprise Multi-User, which is an operating system that is only available in Microsoft Azure. So once we define the workspace, once we have powered it with the host pool, then we actually give users access to the virtual desktops or the applications with application groups. So it's at the application group level where the users are now assigned and have access to virtual desktops or virtual apps and now are subscribed to that workspace. So this user here, he's using the Windows Virtual Desktop Client app. When he pulls it up, and he can access the Finance desktop. And these items right here are published through an application group. And then these are powered by a host pool, which is running inside of a workspace. So now that we know the difference between Windows Virtual Desktop workspaces, host pools, and application groups, let's start with our Windows Virtual Desktop workspaces. This is how we logically design out the system to get to the more interesting parts, which is building out the host pools. But anyway, this is how we plan for security and cost efficiency. And these are the questions we would ask when we're developing the system at Cerulean. Are there going to be any groups of users with more intense security than others? So in other words, do we want to build a standard virtual desktop that has open access to local printers, that you can move files back and forth between local hard drives? Or do we want to lock down these virtual desktops a little bit more or a lot more? Are we working with sensitive apps? Are we working with sensitive data? Are we going to be working from untrusted or personal devices, like a bring your own device scenario that I was talking about earlier? Then when it comes to cost efficiency, we need to ask the question, are we going to have any expensive compute instances? Are there going to be any users that are using graphics intensive or calculation intensive apps? So graphics intensive, they might be doing CAD or 3D modeling, or if it's number crunching intensive, like we have a client, they run an app and that app does number crunching for an entire week. There's no graphics, it's just crunching numbers. And so if we have either one of those, we're going to need a more expensive compute instance. So we need to define that workspace and power with virtual machines, but making sure that we are only giving users that need access to those more expensive compute instances, but making sure that we're only giving the users that need it access to those much more expensive compute instances. So defining these workspaces, this is the first thing we've got to do, and we're going to be doing it based on security needs and how expensive those compute instances are for special things such as graphics or high intensity calculations. So once we've defined our workspaces, here's a couple scenarios. We could end up with one single workspace just for general users. A general user, they might just need Teams, Outlook, Word, Excel, a web browser to access certain web apps. They don't have any high video compute, disk IO requirements. They don't have any highly sensitive apps or data. This will be a low cost per user. Or after we design out the system, we might have 3 different workspaces. We could have our general user workspace, which I just described, but we might also have an engineering workspace for AutoCAD users. These people are working with large files. They have high video compute and disk IO requirements, and it's pricier compute and storage in Azure. So we're going to limit through our application groups how many users have access to this workspace. And then we also might have a highly secured user workspace. These people are in the finance group, so they're working with highly sensitive finance, HR, proprietary apps or data. And we want to control data from being able to be printed locally to a printer that's not over at the office, or we want to be able to control it so people can't move files to local hard drives. So we might end up with 3 different workspaces. And then once we get that done, we power those with host pools. This is now where we go in and design out the virtual machines that are actually going to power these workspaces. So now that gets us to powering a Windows Virtual Desktop host pool. So here's the thought process you need to go through and what we go through when we're designing out a system at Cerulean. Number 1, are we powering virtual desktops or virtual apps? So a lot of this discussion, most of it is going to be around providing virtual desktops to your users, but sometimes you might want to keep a local desktop, but just give them a virtual app. It is cheaper to power virtual apps than it is virtual desktops. And then how many concurrent users are we going to have during business hours? So 10 a.m. Tuesday, what is our max load we're going to be putting on this system? That's a very important number. And we're going to be talking that when we get to the calculation part of building out our host pools. And then how many concurrent users are we going to be supporting outside of business hours? Again, another very important number. Are we doing high-end graphics or number crunching? Those are pricier compute instances, as I've discussed before. What's the user intensity? Are they running Teams, Outlook, Word, Excel? Do they have 2-3 different PDFs up from Adobe Reader? Do they have a web browser open with 20 different web pages going? How intense is that user? How much pressure are they putting on those virtual desktop session hosts? And do we need Teams audio, video, and phones? So as I've demoed before, you could get just video. Like if you want to be able to go watch YouTube videos, and you had a business requirement to do that, that takes more processing. If you want to be able to see video in Teams, that takes more processing power. If you want to be able to use the Microsoft phone system, that takes more processing power. So we need to factor that in when we're powering a Windows Virtual Desktop host pool. Then we need to determine our users per vCPU ratio. So in the world of Azure, we have compute instances, and these compute instances, and I have an example of the F series here below. Each one of these has a certain number of vCPUs, RAM. It can host a certain number of disks and a certain amount of input-output from the disk drive. And so the question is, for example, this one right here, this F4SV2 compute instance has 4 vCPUs. What ratio do we want to use when we power this Windows Virtual Desktop session host? Do we want to put 4 users per vCPU for a standard user, or for a power user, maybe we take that down to 2 users per vCPU. If it's a graphics intensive user, maybe it's 1-to-1. And so here, for example, on this F4SV2, if we're doing a ratio of 4-to-1 for users per vCPU, well, 4 users here on a 4-to-1 ratio, and we have 4 vCPUs, I should be able to put 16 users on that compute instance for a standard user. But if it's a power user and it's 2 users per vCPU, it's going to be 2 users per vCPU times 4 vCPUs. That means I can get 8 users on there. And if I have a graphics intensive user, I wouldn't be using F series anyway, but anyway, if I had a graphics intensive user and I had a 1-to-1 ratio, well, with 4 vCPUs, I would just have 4 users on there. That is a very important number that you have to determine. I'm going to show you a little bit more about that shortly. But that user ratio, these are some guidelines that have worked well for us, and you're going to need that when you're designing out the system. You're also going to need to keep your bandwidth per user in mind as well. So here's some guidelines that have worked well for us. The guidelines that Microsoft provides, and you can find bits and pieces from Microsoft on guidelines out there, but I think they're pretty conservative. And I understand if you're Microsoft, you got to make very conservative guidelines. These are the guidelines that have worked well for us. And these are guidelines that you can use when you're designing out your own system. But if it's a standard user, you would want to make sure that you can give that user at least 1 megabit per second bandwidth. So for example, if you had 50 users, you'd want to make sure that you have at least a 50 megabit up and down internet connection for standard users. If you had power users, you want to make sure that each one of those users has 2 megabits per second of bandwidth. So if you had 50 power users, you'd need a 100 megabit, ideally fiber internet connection with low latency. And that's another aspect of it. And when I say low latency, you'd want to make sure that the latency between you and the Azure data center is going to be under 60 seconds. It should be somewhere, even on a consumer level cable internet connection, you should be able to get 40, 50. But that latency is a factor as well. And again, going to the data center where you're actually going to be building your Azure virtual network. And if it's a graphics intensive user, you want to give that user 4 megabits of bandwidth. So depending on your workspaces, are we putting in standard users, power users, graphics intensive users? There's the user to vCPU ratio, and there's also how much bandwidth you need to have so the users don't have a laggy experience that frustrates them. And down here, I just have what I have for a standard user would be a 1080p resolution at 30 frames per second. And for a graphics intensive user, that would be a 2K display at 30 frames per second. But this gives you some guidelines that you can work with to make sure that not only are we properly powering the session hosts in the session host pools for our Windows Virtual Desktop, we need to make sure back at our office we have the proper amount of bandwidth, either at the office, a branch office, or at a home office to have a smooth experience. Now we come to picking a compute series. So if you go into the Azure portal, and it can be an overwhelming experience, you're going to see like 100 different compute instances. There's a bunch of different compute series. I still remember years and years ago when I went back and I was really new in Azure, and it was just, even then, it was so overwhelming. But I can simplify this for you. Your typical users, you're going to want a D series compute instance. The engineering CAD finance users, those will be F series. And the GPU, the high-end graphics, 3D rendering user, that'll be the NV series. If they need to do heavy calculations, you'll probably want to look at the NC series. But it's important to understand the D series versus the F series here. And these will be the compute instances you're going to be using for your session hosts most of the time. The D series has a high amount of memory to compute ratio, whereas the F series, it's more even. So the F series would be somebody that's like a standard user, but they need extra number crunching power. Whereas the D series would be the typical user day in and day out. And again, NV series for the high-end graphics, 3D rendering user. And also it's an important thing to note that the minimum amount of vCPUs that you want to put in any session host would be 4. 2, it's just too slow. So the minimum is 4. If you can do 8 and make that work with multiple session hosts, it's a good way to go. But 4 would be your minimum. And then from there, you're going to pick which series makes most sense. And these are the guidelines that we use when we're building out a system. So I'm going to take you through the formula we use when we're calculating how many session hosts we need in a host pool. So the first thing we got to find out is, what is the max concurrent host pool users? That's that Tuesday, 10 a.m. What is the biggest number of users we need to support in this host pool? So we need that number, we plug it in here, and then we divide it by our user to vCPU ratio. And that goes back to this over here. Remember, we had standard users, we'll have 4 users to 1 vCPU, more lightly powered. We have power users, we'll have 2 users per vCPU. Graphics intensive users, it'll be 1 to 1. So that's that user to vCPU ratio. It's usually going to be 2 to 1 or 4 to 1. So again, we're going to divide the max concurrent host pool users. So if it's going to be 64 users, we plug that number in here, and then we're going to divide that by our user to vCPU ratio, which usually is going to be 2, or a 4. And then that number, once we run that number, that'll give us the max vCPUs needed at peak demand, the maximum amount of CPUs or processors that we need at peak demand. And then we take that number, we divide that number, the max amount of vCPUs needed at peak demand, and we divide that by 4, because 4 is our minimum vCPUs per compute instance that we configure at Xerillion. Sometimes it's 8, most of the time it's 4. Again, going back to this slide, the minimum we do, and I'm talking about that minimum of an F4S in the F series, for example, there's 4 vCPUs. Sometimes we'll do an F8, and then we'll run the calculation like that. But that's what I'm referring to. And so once we do that math, where we take the max vCPUs needed at peak demand and divide it by 4, then we get our key number, the max session hosts needed. This is the number of session hosts to power the host pool. So here's an example. We take the max concurrent host pool users, again, Tuesday, 10 a.m. Let's say that's 64. I'm just using easy numbers here. 64 users. And then our user to vCPU ratio, we're using the standard users for this workspace and this host pool, is 4. So we take 64 divided by 4, that gives us 16. That 16 is this number right here, the max vCPUs needed at peak demand. Just vCPUs. I'm not talking about virtual machines. Just how many CPUs do we need at peak demand? Now I've got 16. Then what I do is I take the max vCPUs needed at peak demand, which is 16. I divide that by 4, because 4 is the minimum amount of vCPUs that we would put in a virtual machine. So I would take the max vCPUs needed at peak demand divided by 4, and that will give us our max session hosts needed. In this case, it would be 4. So the maximum amount of vCPUs we needed was 16. I divided that by 4. So that tells me I need 4 virtual machines in our session host pool to meet peak demand. And then this is what we're going to do. We're going to scale in and scale out. During business hours, we're going to run all 4 session hosts. And then outside business hours, let's say 5 o'clock, we're going to put these virtual machines into drain mode, and we're going to only leave 1 after hours. So anybody that needs to get in after hours, 10 p.m. on Friday, 3 p.m. on Sunday, whatever, we're going to be able to take care of those users. And then at the start of the business day again, let's say 6 a.m. on Monday, we're going to scale out to all 4 session hosts. And that's how this system is set up. So what we've done here is we've powered this appropriately for what our users need. We can support our users during peak demand, but then outside of business hours, we are running at 1/4 the cost. We have 1 out of 4 machines running, but we are still able to support those users outside of business hours, and they can get in and do everything that they need. So we just covered the most expensive part of running that Windows Virtual Desktop session host, which is the compute instance that is used to power that session host. But also critically important, but much less expensive, but it's an important part, is what we're using for disk storage on that session host. We always use premium SSD drives. When we do that, we get a 99.9% single instance uptime SLA from Microsoft. And what do I mean by that? It used to be, before we had premium SSD drives, that the only way to get an uptime SLA on a virtual machine is to have 2 of them running side by side. Well, with premium SSD drives, Microsoft will give us that 99.9% uptime SLA. So every virtual machine we put in any Azure virtual network always has premium SSD drives. And you got to pay attention to the IOPS. So each compute instance gets a certain amount of disk I/O, how fast it can move data back and forth between the processor and the hard drive. We've absolutely had situations before where we bought a premium SSD drive and put that into the session host, and it had enough storage, but it didn't have enough disk IOPS. So we had to increase our compute instance that was powering the virtual machine to get a higher IOPS, because the users needed more of them to run the apps on their virtual desktops. Now, as I mentioned before, in terms of storage, we are going to use premium SSD drives to power our Windows Virtual Desktop session hosts. But we also need to use a service to be able to host our user profiles and any file shares that we need to run things like large files for the person that's running CAD, or maybe there are just files that work with a legacy Windows app to run your business. But we would use Azure Files for that. And it's Azure's file server as a service. And we're only going to pay for the storage we need. We get that 99.9% uptime SLA, and we have that soft delete feature, which I talked about earlier. But we need to know how much space are we going to need in Azure Files to properly configure and price out the system, but this is what we're going to use. Now, there have been a couple rare cases where we had to move up their existing file server and put a Windows Server virtual machine as a file server there. But we really want to try to avoid that and just use cloud services, and that's what Azure Files is for. And then on our virtual network, we need to back it up. We use Azure Backup. We don't pay anything for the service, we just pay for the backup storage that we have. And then we need to determine what your backup intensity is going to be. We need to do a daily backup of your Azure Files file shares. And it's important to remember, we have that soft delete feature, so you can probably scale back on this a little bit. If somebody clobbers a file, you might be able to just go to the soft delete folder and recover the file instead of having to go and pull it out of Azure Backup. We'll do a weekly backup of the session hosts because they're not going to be changing very much. And then we need to retain backups based on your backup intensity and budget. The backups allow us to go back in time. It's not a recovery situation. It allows us to go back in time. So do we want to do 7 daily backups, 4 weekly backups, 12 monthlies, 5 yearlies? And at what point do we start deleting the backups? After we've made you feel comfortable that you can go back in time, but you don't want to waste money holding on to backups that are backing up data, or retaining data that you don't care about anymore. And then there is, what level of intensity do you want as far as a meteor or bomb taking out the Azure data center where your virtual desktops are located? I'm serious, it's going to be a situation like that. And I explain it to people like this. If we're just relying on Azure Backup and a bomb or meteor does take out the data center where your virtual network is at, these things are automatically replicated to another data center somewhere. Again, like your email is or your files are with OneDrive. We built an Azure virtual network specifically at a data center, and that doesn't get replicated somewhere else. If we want to build a hot site somewhere else, we got to do it and configure it. And it adds about 15 to 20% onto the monthly budget for a Windows Virtual Desktop solution. But here's the thing. If we're just relying on backups and something happens to the data center where your virtual network is at, what happens is we have to go build out an Azure virtual network at another data center. Again, this assumes the data center that your virtual network is at is completely wiped out from a bomb or a meteor strike. So we have to go get the backups. We have to rebuild your virtual network. We have to pull your virtual machines out from Azure Backup, restore the Azure file shares, and recover your system. So let's say there's 20, 30 customers that your Microsoft Cloud provider has over in that Azure virtual network. Where are you in that pecking order? How fast can they get to you? It's going to take longer to recover your network from Azure Backup, and it won't be something they can just hit right away, most likely. So you want to determine that. It's a question you need to ask them. If you are not comfortable with the answer that they give you, then you need to consider Azure Site Recovery. And bottom line is, let's say a bomb or meteor takes out the data center where your Azure virtual network is at. We can use Azure Site Recovery to recover your virtual network in minutes to an hour. Because what happens is we build a warm site over in the other data center. The same data center that has another triplicate set of copies of your backup. So you have 3 copies of your backup in your primary data center, the one that gets taken out. And then we have another set of 3 copies over in the other data center where we have your warm network already built and ready to go. The beauty of this is, though, in the world of Azure, having that standby network is really inexpensive because we're not running virtual machines over there. We're synchronizing virtual machines, but we're not running them. And so if something happens to your primary data center and we're like, whoa, we need to get this system back up really quick, no problem. We already have a warm Azure virtual network ready to go with synchronized copies of your virtual machines from potentially minutes ago. And we can go ahead and just bring it up. And also makes disaster recovery extremely easy to test. And again, this is something that adds on about 15-20% more onto the cost of your monthly Azure subscription. In my opinion, it's well worth it, but we can take you through that. And if you're working with another Microsoft Cloud solution provider, make sure you talk to them. Don't just assume the Azure virtual network is protected if something happens to that data center. And it really comes down to if you're signing contracts with big shot clients, or you have a board, or you have something that just says that your company can get back and recovered in business within minutes, hours, days, and can test this, then you want to make sure that you have Azure Site Recovery in place. And as I discussed previously, we want to make sure we're using Azure Active Directory domain services and getting away from using domain controllers. Now, the Windows Virtual Desktop session hosts, they need to be connected to a domain controller, but they don't need to be connected to a domain controller we built. We can use Azure Active Directory domain services, which is synchronizing your Azure Active Directory accounts, which are inside of Microsoft 365. And that's a nice way to operate. And it's important to understand the difference between Azure Active Directory and Azure Active Directory domain services. I know it's confusing, but Azure Active Directory are the things around Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, Teams, OneDrive, Microsoft Intune. That's our main security hub. Those are where our main identities are at. And then we get synchronized copies of those accounts brought over into our Azure Virtual Network. And we get that with Azure Active Directory domain services because it's Microsoft Azure's Windows Server Domain Controller as a service. And we get a 99.9% uptime SLA. If we build a couple virtual machines up in your Microsoft Azure network, we build those ourselves as domain controllers. There is no uptime SLA for that service. We'll have an uptime SLA for the virtual machine itself, but not for the service. And there's no Windows Server hardware or software to manage. It works with traditional Active Directory admin apps, the ones you're all used to working with. It syncs with Microsoft 365 Azure Active Directory and allows us to avoid a traditional Windows Server domain controller. And then there is the aspect of securing that Windows Virtual Desktop, keeping it secure, keeping it stable, keeping the data safe, keeping the data under your control. And here's the things you want to have in place. We need to enable MFA at the virtual desktop login from any unknown device to Azure Active Directory. So the Windows Virtual Desktop app, when we connect in, we should be prompted if Azure Active Directory has not seen that device before, even before they get over to the Windows Virtual Desktop. And if Azure Active Directory still has concerns about that user for some reason, when you get to that virtual desktop, it should still be able to prompt for multi-factor authentication. We want to keep the session host secure and stable and keep it protected from users going unknowingly to websites that have malicious code or content. We want to either protect that with a virtual WatchGuard firewall, content filter, or we want to use Microsoft Defender ATP content filter. This is a newer thing that we can protect Windows Virtual Desktops with the Microsoft Defender ATP content filter. So you don't necessarily need a virtual firewall anymore. We might want to block the movement of data between the virtual computer and the local computer. I think that's a smart idea. Maybe not always. Maybe if somebody's on the road and they're using a mobile thin client, maybe they need to be able to move data back and forth. But you want to ask that question and determine if you want to do that blocking. And then you might want to block the movement of data between web apps and virtual computers with Microsoft Intune. So Microsoft Intune has the way where if somebody is inside of a virtual desktop and they say, well, I'm blocked from being able to move that data onto a local hard drive or a thumb drive or something like that, but I'm not blocked from logging into my Dropbox account or my Google Drive account and just putting the data there. You can use Microsoft Intune to control a very secured, dedicated Windows Virtual Desktop session host dedicated to that user. So it's not multi-session, but on a personal, dedicated Windows Virtual Desktop session host, you can use Microsoft Intune to block that capability. So they can't even move that data, or they'll at least get prompted, hey, it looks like you're taking company data and moving it outside of the company. Just making sure you want to do this because it's going to be logged. I have another video about that whole aspect and how all that works, but you can do that, but you can't do it on a multi-session host version of Windows 10. You can do it in a personally dedicated host pool. So each user logs in, they get a dedicated session host. As I talked about earlier, it is a very modest cost to enable Azure Defender to monitor the session host for unusual user or app behavior. It keeps track of what is normal behavior for users of the apps on those session hosts. And when we start to see something that's weird, let's say there's an app and it's connecting inside the host pool, doing weird, quirky things that Azure Defender says, well, I don't know, it doesn't look like a virus, but it's doing strange things. What do you want me to do? Do you want me to block it, send a notification to the administrator? But we set those parameters and then we tell Azure Defender what we want it to do. Is it a block or is it a notification? And then Microsoft 365 Cloud App Security. This is where we monitor for insider threats. So would you like to know if somebody has copied the entire sales folder somewhere else outside of the company, or shared it, or somebody has deleted 20 gigs of data from the company? Microsoft 365 Cloud App Security protects you from those insider threats when somebody's inside of their virtual desktop inside those cloud services. So these are the things that we would put in place and we would talk to you about depending on your subscriptions and depending on your security intensity, the things that you want to put in place to make sure that your virtual desktops stay secure and stable. So here's the things we've gone over. We logically defined our Windows Virtual Desktop workspaces in our design based on security, app and data sensitivity, and how pricey the compute instances might be, depending on if we need high-end graphics or number crunching. We spec'd out our Windows Virtual Desktop host pools to power the workspaces. We defined our backup intensity. How far back in time do we want to be able to retrieve data that was deleted accidentally or intentionally? We define our disaster recovery intensity. If a meteor or bomb takes out our Azure data center, how quickly do we want to be able to recover in another Azure data center? And we defined our security intensity. So what are the services we want to put in place to keep those Windows Virtual Desktops stable and also keep that data secure in our control? Now that we've done all this design work and planning work, we actually have to figure out what all this is going to cost. So let's get into the pricing. Now, I put this together with the idea that maybe you don't want to change out everything right now, and you want to do maybe a smaller pilot project or a proof of concept. And that's what I've got here is a Windows Virtual Desktop proof of concept monthly Azure pricing, general users. So if we were setting up computers for the majority of the users in the company, doing day-to-day work inside of computers and apps. So the general users. And we're going to do an apples to apples desktop replacement. So there's features you get with Windows Virtual Desktop or things you can add on with Windows Virtual Desktop that you don't even have as an option in a traditional physical computer setup. And I'm not going to include those things in Windows Virtual Desktop. So we're pricing it out apples to apples. We're doing one defined Windows Virtual Desktop workspace. We're talking about Outlook, Teams, chat, web browsing, Word, Excel, Adobe Reader. No Teams audio or video or phones. No high-end graphics or compute. No backup and disaster recovery. And we're going to be using Microsoft Defender antivirus. So now here are the prices right here. And I'm pricing this out two different ways. And this is real world pricing that you would pay for a setup like this. So I have business hours pricing. So if you were just running this system with 8 users in this case, running it during business hours, and then I have 24/7 pricing. So again, this general user single Windows Virtual Desktop workspace setup, again, a Windows Virtual Desktop proof of concept. Okay, so maybe this isn't replacing everybody in your company. So we're powering this system for 8 users. And we're only going to be running this during business hours. So your total monthly cost for the Windows Virtual Desktop computers is $184 a month. And that comes to $23 per user per month for a Windows Virtual Desktop computer. To me, that is incredibly cheap. Incredibly cheap. And once we have this set up, we don't have to replace any hardware. Yeah, depending on what hardware you use for connecting into the Windows Virtual Desktop itself, maybe you're going to use thin clients, but those have a really long life cycle, 8-10 years. Or maybe you have a bring your own device policy with your employees. So you're going to rent business use of their desktop or their laptop so they can connect in to your company's virtual desktop. That is really inexpensive. And if we want to run this 24/7, then we take those same 8 users and now it's $312 a month. So that comes to $39 per user per month. Again, running 24/7. That's where we do something like we might have 4 session hosts running during business hours to accommodate everybody. And then we scale it in. So we're just running 1 overnight. But as you can see here, as we add users to the system, we have economies of scale. So 16 users, that's going to be more money. We're going to go from $312 a month to $432 a month. When we're going from 8 to 16 users, but the per user cost now goes from $39 a month to $27 a month. And then 32 users, the total goes up to $576 a month from $432, but now our cost per user is $18 per user per month, and so on and so forth, up till we get to 256 users. That monthly Windows Virtual Desktop Azure consumption subscription that you have is $3,072 per month, but that comes to $12 per user per month for a Windows Virtual Desktop. So depending on how many users you put in this system, you can get these economies of scale, and it's going to reduce the cost per user per month. And then there's no hardware to deal with here except for whatever thin clients you use to connect into the virtual desktops. Or if you reprovision your existing physical desktops with the full OS on it, but you just give them new life because all they're doing is now connecting into a Windows virtual desktop. So take the existing physical computer that you have for that user, maybe the one you're thinking about replacing because it's getting a little bit old, but now all it has to do is run the Windows Virtual Desktop Client app and connect into a virtual desktop. So you can double the life on this thing. And then when it dies one day, you just replace it with an inexpensive thin client computer. Or like I've suggested before, if your organization can have a bring your own device policy where you can rent access to employees' personal devices and then have no hardware to manage or maintain anymore as well, you're just providing everybody access to their virtual desktops. That is a very clean, very nice way to go. And it reduces the amount of professional support that you need to manage that computer network. And again, I'm going to say this to IT people, it's only a threat if you don't adapt your skills to this. If you adapt your skills and get this experience and get the certification, get the training where you can actually put stuff like this in and still be an internal IT person, you're going to be high in demand. But if you don't, and you see this as a threat and you bury your head in the sand, it's going to be a tougher go for you for your career. So now I want to go through a comparison because you might be thinking, well, okay, here's what it costs to run this in Azure for my general users. And I can see what you're doing as far as the users, how many users I'm working with, whether it's business hours or 24/7, what the total monthly cost is and the per user cost. But you know what? I got to compare that to doing the traditional legacy approach of having physical computers. As best I can, compare apples to apples between those two different types of costs. All right, well, let's do this. So in this setup of this Windows Virtual Desktop proof of concept, I'm using this with 32 users. And I have a scenario where we're running just during business hours and one where we are running 24/7. So if we're running business hours, that's $340 per month, $11 per user per month. If we're running 24/7 for those 32 users, it's $576 and $18 per user per month. And we're running a D4 series compute instance of Microsoft Azure. And that's going to be an Intel Xeon Platinum processor running at 3.4 gigahertz. Now, it's important to understand that here we have no capital cost. So we're not going to have to take these 32 users and do a huge refresh project, or a third of the computers one year, then a third of the computers another year, then a third of the computers. All that goes away. We issue virtual desktops, and then it becomes a matter of what minimal hardware do we use to get people to be able to connect into those virtual desktops. So there's no capital cost here. It's all operating expense. The remote access, disaster recovery, and business continuity is built into this solution. So with an on-premise system, nobody's taking a disaster recovery appliance and applying that to the individual computers. If you are, and some of you may be, you're the oddball. Everybody's protecting the back end, they're protecting the servers with that kind of system. Well, here, with all of our emails, files, phones, data and device controls, all that inside of Microsoft 365 Cloud Services, and then our desktops become virtual desktops in Microsoft Azure, well, everything's in the cloud. So our remote access, disaster recovery, business continuity, it's all built into the solution. We don't have to put on extra things or extra add-ons to be able to put those things in place. There's no additional costs in this solution for that. And that's an important point because that is a significant cost with an on-premise system. And you also have to factor in that it's 60% less expensive with internal or external IT support costs. So if you're an IT manager and you're part of that internal support, again, I'm going to say this is the way things are going. So if you bury your head in the sand or complain or see that as a threat, you're just hurting your career prospects. Your CFO, your CEO, they're talking to other executives and other companies, and they're hearing about these things from their enlightened IT people. And so you can be one of the people who just knows how to put these systems in or drive this for your company, and you've adapted and gained a huge skill. But the fact is, your IT operating budget includes either your internal or external IT services to support a traditional system. Well, it's 60% less expensive if you have virtual desktops, and that affects your operating budget. So you have to factor that in. And there's no hardware refresh projects. Once this system goes in, the only thing you'll have to replace here and there are whatever you're using to become the thin clients to connect into these virtual desktops. And again, if your organization can do a bring your own device policy, and I know not all can, but most can, then you can just rent access to an employee's personal computer, personal device, pay them for that business access, and then they use that as the thin client to connect in to their virtual desktop securely. And if they leave the company, then you have no hardware to manage. There's nothing for them to send back. You just disable access to their virtual desktop. So that's the Azure scenario. And over here, let's compare the physical desktop computer. So again, number-wise, over here, we got the Azure D4 series, Intel Xeon processor, 3.4 gigahertz. I've got this set up for 32 users, business hours, or running 24/7. Okay, so if we were to go ahead and replace this with similar desktop computers, what would that look like? So I went and I saw the closest thing I could get to a Xeon processor, 3.4 gigahertz, and giving 32 users access to that. It'd be the HP Z2 Mini. And those with tax, out the door, street price, $950 each. So I'm gonna get 32 of these things. So it's $30,400, and I estimated a 4-year life cycle. Some of you have a 3-year life cycle for your computers. If you're really on it and you're pretty aggressive about that, making sure that the computers don't get junkier and junkier over time as they kind of die off. But some of you also might have 5-year life cycles, or you just replace them when they die. But I went with a 4-year life cycle. And what that comes down to is if you move that to a per user monthly amount, that comes to $19 per month on a raw analysis. So I'm talking hard numbers, not soft numbers, and you do need to factor those things in. The support costs, the fact the disaster recovery system and business continuity is included in here. Those are huge numbers to impact this, but I didn't even put those in. So you go, oh, that's $19 per month per user versus 11 versus 18. And then your 4-year hardware refresh projects and capital outlays for services, not for the equipment itself, but for the services, whether that's internal IT people or external IT people. I estimated that at $10,000 to refresh 32 computers. There's no disaster recovery or business continuity as part of that cost. Here, it's part of the system. And you're still going to need locally hosted firewalls and VPNs required for remote access. So one of the things people might look at this and go, well, here I can just leave these workstations on. We can run them 24/7. Here, you can save money by running it during business hours, but if I run it 24/7, that's extra cost. I don't have those extra costs over here on this side. But then you're going to have to host a firewall and a VPN, and you're going to be hosting internet access to those computers, these physical computers. And people are going to have this, access one computer at a time. You're going to have to set that up, support it, maintain it. And it's going to be 60% more expensive to maintain by internal or external IT support. Not to mention, this is just generally, it's just a legacy approach. The world is moving away from this. Windows Virtual Desktop is one of the hottest technologies that Microsoft has right now. So you might say, well, just because it's hot, we don't have to put it in. Absolutely, I would agree with that. But when you look at all the numbers and all you get, if I go ahead and move to Windows Virtual Desktop, as opposed to doing this legacy approach of having all this hardware on site, it's actually much more expensive to maintain and host these computers here. And even if you don't even care about the IT support operating costs, or if you don't care about the headaches of doing refreshes with all this equipment, all these other things, even the hard number analysis, this is $19 per user per month, hard numbers, raw, without all this other stuff. And here, we're still right there in the ballpark. This includes the business continuity. This includes no hardware refresh projects, no capital costs. This is $11 per user per month for these 32 users. This is $18 per user per month with these 32 users. Over here, this is $19, but there's still a bunch of other costs we need to factor in on this. This over here on the Azure side is a much better deal. Now, how about Windows Virtual Desktop proof of concept, monthly Azure pricing for high-end graphics users? For most organizations, this would actually be a small group of people. Or in the case where this is a large group of users for you, this will be even more impactful to your numbers. But this is what I'm seeing. Again, if I do an apples-to-apples desktop replacement, one defined Windows Virtual Desktop workspace for these high-end graphics users. Maybe this is your test case, your proof of concept, because getting the high-end engineering computers in itself is expensive. And then providing remote access for those users to their desktops also takes more time, more thought, more infrastructure on site. But they're going to be using Outlook, Teams chat, web browsing, Word, Excel, Adobe Reader. And here they're going to be doing high-end graphics rendering. They are going to be using Teams, audio, video, and phones. And I'm not factoring any backward disaster recovery services on top of this, because we wouldn't be putting those in place for the end user computers on a on-premise system. And then we're using Microsoft Defender Antivirus. So for 6 users during business hours, it's $252 per month. That's $42 per user per month. And if we want to run that 24/7, that for 6 users, then it's going to be $720 per month, or $120 per user per month. And for 12 users, that'll be $972 a month, or $81 per user per month. And we're going to get that same economies of scale. If we add more users, it's going to decrease the cost per user per month. And we're going to be running an NVIDIA Tesla M60 GPU, and the processor is going to be an Intel Xeon E5. And that's with the NV series compute instance that we would use as really to power this system. Now, comparing that to a physical engineering workstation looks something like this. So I'm going to do the Azure NV Compute Series, again with the NVIDIA Tesla M60 GPU, Intel Xeon E5, and 6 users during business hours, $252 per month, and $42 per user per month. Running at 24/7 for 6 users is going to be $720 per month total, $120 per user per month. There's no capital cost, there's no remote access, disaster recovery, and the remote access, as in the other scenario, the remote access, disaster recovery, and business continuity is built into the system. So if you have a situation where you have some sort of disaster at the office, or there's a pandemic, nobody's going to the office, people will just connect in to their engineering virtual desktop that's already in the cloud. That's it. So business continuity is built in, your disaster recovery is taken care of, your remote access is taken care of, and there's nothing that you're going to need to host on site for those people to be able to get in from home. And again, it's 60% less expensive for internal or an external IT support. And there's no hardware refresh projects. So once we set these up, they're available to us. We can increase the capacity, or we can decrease the capacity. We might want to increase the capacity because we're adding more people. We might want to decrease the capacity if the company is having maybe some tougher times, maybe lost a big client or something like that and needs some time to recover. We can actually reduce those IT costs. Now let's compare it to a traditional legacy approach of setting up a bunch of engineering workstations. Well, the closest I could come to this was 6 HP Z6 G4 workstations. They're $3,000 each. So we got 6 of them. So $18,000 total over a 4-year life cycle. That comes to hard number raw analysis of $62.50 per month. And you can compare that here to running that during business hours for those 6 users, or running that 24/7. And again, the more users you have, the lower that per user per month price goes. But here we have a 4-year hardware refresh project and capital outlays. Again, I'm putting 4 years here. You might be on a 3-year replacement plan, or a 5-year replacement plan, or your company might be one where you run the computer until it absolutely dies, until the engineer can't possibly stand working on it anymore. Here, there is no disaster recovery and business continuity. Here, this price includes that. It just includes it because it's just how the system is set up to go from the beginning. Our remote access on this side, done. Our disaster recovery on this side, done. Our business continuity, if we can't get access to the office, done. Over here, we have to add those costs in. And I didn't, just because I want to give you a hard number analysis. Hard numbers. Okay, but if you were smart and you were the IT director, the IT manager, the chief information officer, you have to do this analysis because your CFO, the CEO wants to see, are you looking at the bigger picture and not just the numbers and that's it? Because as a business, we're smarter than that, right? If you do want to provide remote access, if you do want to provide disaster recovery and business continuity, you have to add those costs in. And you're going to still maintain the old-fashioned locally hosted firewall and VPN required for the remote access. And here, as I've talked so many times about, it's 60% more expensive to maintain by internal or external IT support. Whether you have an internal IT department or whether you outsource all or part of that to another company, the point is having this system over here where we do not manage the hardware, where we just manage the virtual desktops, is so much less problematic and so much simpler than all of this stuff. You can reduce those costs, and that is your operating budget. And I've said so many times, this reduction in your internal or external IT support cost, that monthly cost, once you properly put in a Windows Virtual Desktop solution, that reduction in the support cost and the complexity should more than pay for getting these virtual desktops moved up into the cloud. Now let's look at this interesting scenario, which is, what if we want to take general users, but we also want to give them access to the Teams audio, video, and phones? Well, we got to increase the power of our compute instance in Microsoft Azure. So this will be an Apple's desktop replacement comparison. We'll have one defined Windows Virtual Desktop workspace. We're talking Outlook, Teams chat, web browsing, Word, Excel, Adobe Reader, but we're also adding in Teams audio, video, phones. So if you want to have a Windows Virtual Desktop where that person can put on a headset or a webcam and they can do full audio, video through Microsoft Teams. So probably most people, they want to be able to use the phone system part of it, which you can do through the virtual desktop. And maybe they want to be able to turn on their video on virtual desktops as well. But there's going to be no high-end graphics or compute, no back-end disaster recovery. And again, we're going to be using Microsoft Defender antivirus. So in a scenario like that, if we're running 8 users, that's going to be during business hours, that's going to be $240 per month or $30 per user per month. If we want to run that 24/7 for 8 users, that's going to take us to $496 per month and will be $62 per user per month. And then we have the same economies of scale. If we take that up to 16 users, the monthly Azure bill will be $912. It'll be $57 per user per month. 32 users, $1,728 or $54 per user per month. Now, I know you would look at that and go, we could set up physical computers much cheaper than that. Again, you need to take some things into account here, which is this includes backup and disaster. This includes remote access. This includes business continuity because that system is up in the cloud. With your physical desktops over at the office, that does not include that. You actually have to have a separate system that is not as good as this. You're going to have a way, if you have a bunch of desktop computers for people, then you're going to have a way to either take those computers out or give people remote access into them, or you're going to give everybody laptops, but you're still going to be hosting something at your office. And you're still going to be dealing with the capital cost and the ongoing headaches of maintaining physical computers, supporting physical computers. That requires additional IT support, whether you have internal IT support or external IT support. That has more overhead to it, more hassle, more downtime for the users. The Windows Virtual Desktops cleans so much of that up. It's much simpler. So moving this here, even though on a raw hard number analysis, you're saying, I'm only going to factor in the absolute cost of that hardware versus having this in Azure, you're missing the total point. And I would also say, if that's the analysis you're doing, going into your CFO or going into the CEO, they might not say it in that meeting, but they might be wondering if you're missing the boat on that, because it wouldn't be a proper analysis. Anyway, this gives you an idea of, if we add in Teams, audio, video, and phones, what the numbers come out to be. So we've gone over the overview, we've gone over how to configure and design out the system, we've gone out how to price the system out. But let's talk about the Windows Virtual Desktop add-ons that we would put into your Windows Virtual Desktop solution. So we'd want to do an Azure backup of your Windows 10 session host. A weekly snapshot should be fine. They're not going to be changing very much, but those are individual virtual machines and they're being used all the time with the users. So we want to at least be able to grab a snapshot in case something happens to one, it gets corrupted, or there's a change to it, and we need to be able to go back in time to the way it was previously. We want to use Azure Backup to back up the FSLogix user profile folder, and we'll do that on a daily basis. And it's important to know that when we are backing up that FSLogix user profile folder, we're using Azure Files. And with Azure Files, we have the soft delete feature in addition to the backup capabilities in Azure Backup. So that soft delete, if something gets deleted intentionally, accidentally, it's going to go into a special folder and it's going to be retained for 7 days. And even if it goes into that special soft delete folder, an admin who really wants to do damage, they can't go and delete that file in the soft delete folder. They could turn off the feature, but that would only apply to things that are deleted after that event. If they turned off the soft delete feature after they deleted something, that will not affect that stuff that was deleted while the soft delete feature was on. So it'll be fully protected. And I've checked that out myself and it works. So it's very reassuring that soft delete capability gives us quick capabilities to be able to go and recover these files if we need to without having to roll back and go find backups in the traditional sense inside of Azure Backup. Azure Site Recovery. So if we want to build a warm site failover in case a meteor or bomb strikes your Azure data center where your Azure virtual network is hosted. Because unlike Microsoft 365 cloud services, and a cloud service is where we do not manage hardware, we do not manage server software, we configure cloud services. So they still need to be reviewed, they still need to be maintained, but we don't deal with the hardware, we don't deal with software updates. All the configuration and monitoring of events that are going inside the system, that's still up to us. When we're building out an Azure virtual network and we're putting virtual desktop machines inside that virtual network, that is not automatically replicated to another data center that's 500 miles away, what we call a peering data center, Microsoft Azure. That has to be configured. And then you need to work with your Microsoft Cloud Solution Provider to determine how fast you want to recover and how much do you want to pay for that ability to recover quickly. And I got to tell you, if you're just relying on Azure Backup to do a geo-redundant storage of backups, which is not a default setting, so hopefully your Microsoft Cloud Solution Provider is configuring at least geo-redundant backups with Azure Backup. But if that's all you're relying on, that's probably not going to get you failed over in a way you want. And that's a whole other topic of discussion. I would highly recommend putting in Azure Site Recovery because it'll add on 15-20% to the cost of your monthly Azure bill. But now you have synced copies of your virtual machines to another data center and also synced copies of your data. So if we do have that meteor bomb strike to your Azure data center, your primary data center where your Azure virtual network is held, we can recover in minutes to an hour your virtual network because it's sitting there on standby, synchronized. And it makes it very easy to test site recoveries as well. And all of this, again, is at a reasonable cost because you might say, well, how likely is it we're going to have a meteor or nuclear bomb strike to the data center? Pretty unlikely. So because that risk is so low, you don't want to get carried away in price. You wouldn't want a solution that doubled the cost of your monthly Azure bill. But you might say, you know what? We have a board of directors, we have big shot clients that we need to show them we've thought through everything here. We're working with their data. So we want to be able to give them a piece of paper that shows, look, we got all this taken care of. And so that's what Azure Site Recovery does for us. And then Azure Defender, this machine learning malware protection for your Windows 10 host computers. So one of the things we clearly want to do when we have all this centralized user access into 4, 8, 12, 16 session hosts in Azure Virtual Network, and we have multiple people on them, we want to make sure they stay safe, secure, and stable. And that's what Azure Defender does. So Azure Defender, as I've talked about earlier, we'd want to add that on, and it's not expensive, to watch what is normal behavior on your virtual desktop computers. And when it sees an app or a user start to verge away from that, it'll raise the alarm or it can disconnect that user. But that's what Azure Defender does. It doesn't need to be a known virus or piece of malware that has a signature for. It just says, this is the way, a baseline way that your company runs on your virtual desktops. This is the baseline way that your Windows virtual desktop machines work. And when it starts to see behavior outside of that norm, that's when the system kicks in and we can configure what we want to happen. Again, either an alert or we have a policy, maybe kicks people out, something like that. But that's what Azure Defender is for. And again, it's modest in cost, and I would add that on. Then on the Xerillion service side, we have the Cerulean Legacy App Transformer, where we will migrate your legacy Windows business apps to that Microsoft Azure virtual network where your Windows virtual desktops are hosted. So as I spoke about in another video, one of the key uses of a Microsoft Azure virtual network is to take your on-premise virtual machines or your on-premise servers and get those migrated up to an Azure virtual network, because you might still be using a legacy Windows app for sales, finance, and operations. It's still very important to your business, and you're not ready to move to the web app version of that software because maybe it's more limited or it's a big project and to get migrated over. And so you're just thinking, all right, look, the Windows version of this app that we've had for 10, 15, 20 years is still well supported. And so we want to continue to use it. And so that's fine. Let's go ahead and let's move the server that we need to get that so your new Windows virtual desktops can now access those servers on the Azure virtual network. So now you're in a situation where you've got your emails, files, phones, security and device controls in Microsoft 365. You've got your virtual desktops in Microsoft Azure, and you have your legacy Windows apps that your company's still using that usually require a SQL server, maybe a file share, maybe a file server, maybe domain controllers that still requires those things. But we've got those as virtual machines inside that same Azure virtual network where your virtual desktop computers are stored. And that's our legacy app transformer. And then there's this Cerulean Confident Cloud Advantage. And this is our managed IT services for Microsoft Cloud Systems. So you could be an internal IT person and we would work with you. We would get you into this system. We would get you trained on it. We could support you up to a point where you feel like you're comfortable to take over. Or there might be a situation where you're like, look, I have other things I'm working with here. I'd rather just have you guys manage it. That's fine too. So we have a process we've developed over the years for a company that has Microsoft 365 cloud services, an Azure virtual network with virtual machines where they're running their legacy business applications up in the Microsoft cloud, and also Windows virtual desktops. There's things that have got to be reviewed. We used to log into servers to do these things. Now we log into portals, but those portals still throw off events and alerts and things that need to be monitored, managed, and maintained. So most IT people are not ready for that. They know they need to get their system modernized. They know they need to get into the cloud. They see the handwriting on the wall, but they're not ready to actually take over the management of it. But they really want to know how to do that, and that's great. We can take over the review of the system, and then alerts we find through our process, we can send it over to the IT manager and they can resolve it. Or we can set up where we review the system, anything we find, we remediate those issues and you handle the help desk. Or we can do all three of those pieces where we do the system review on a proactive basis. We remediate any issues that we find during that system review and any issues that happen between those reviews. And then we're handling the help desk. So if you outsource your IT 100%, well, that's easy. We just come in and we just take over that stuff. But if you're an internal IT manager, my suggestion is we get you migrated, we get you trained, and then you continue to take care of the help desk and the backend management review and remediation of the system. We handle that. And when you're ready to do the review and remediation yourself, you can take that over. That's fine. And we just become your Microsoft Cloud partner. But that's how our Confident Cloud Advantage managed IT services work for Microsoft Cloud Systems. So these are two common things that we set up in addition to the Microsoft 365 cloud services, Windows virtual desktops, or migrating Windows Server virtual machines up into the Azure virtual network. The goal at the end of the day is to get you 100% into the Microsoft Cloud and avoid the landmines, the pitfalls, and all the stuff about you don't know what you don't know. We want to give you the confidence to be able to go and make this migration and do it where you guys are getting modernized, but at the same time, you're only spending what you need to spend. So you're not looking at prices on the Azure portal and going, wow, this is really expensive, because you're probably not pricing it right. But you also want to make sure the system performs well. So if you start going through with this project, that you won't find that you actually underspecified the Azure pieces of this. So it doesn't either perform well because it's not fast enough. In order to make it perform well, it's going to be a lot more expensive than you thought. We can help you avoid all of those problems. We can give you the confidence to get into the system and get your IT modernized. And again, whether you're an internal IT person or whether your company outsources the whole thing, we can support you either way. So if you want to investigate Windows Virtual Desktop further and you want to see a lot of the detail that I had in this video, we have it on our website. So you can go here to cerulean.com/WVD. So all the stuff that I went over in this video, I have there on the web page, and you can read into the detail and the numbers a little further. Now, if you're like, that's great, I'll go to the website, I'll check it out, but I really would like to get into a conversation about Windows Virtual Desktop because it's a technology I'm really interested in, and I am really interested in modernizing our business. I just am tired of trying to pick up these bits and pieces across the internet and Microsoft's different websites. I want a full holistic approach to the whole thing. And I want to work with somebody that can bring the confidence to me and my team to be able to get this in. Then let's have a conversation. We support US businesses that have between 20 to 500 users. So you can go on our website and check us out a little bit further on that. But if that fits you and you would like to talk about this, then great. You can go on to our website, check us out a little further, and we have a contact form and we'll get right back to you on that. You can also email us, support@Xerillion.com, or you can pick up the phone and just call us, 847-995-9800. We're live taking calls 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. Central Time, Monday through Friday. So if you got something out of the video, it would really help me if you hit the thumbs up, and that tells YouTube to go find other people just like you who get this new world of Microsoft Cloud, modern IT. Find them so they can get this video in their feed. I would really appreciate it. And if you want to see additional videos from us, you can hit the subscribe button. Thanks for watching the video, and I'll see you in the next one.